Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. On the evening of February 23, 2020, in the quiet suburb of Winter Park, Florida, what began as a typical night of drinking between two longtime partners would end in one of the most bizarre and disturbing murders in recent Florida history. This is the story of George Torres Jr. and Sarah Boone, a couple whose toxic relationship would culminate in a death so unusual that it would capture national attention and raise uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, manipulation, and the thin line between accident and murder. George Torres Jr. was 42 years old, a man who had struggled with his own demons throughout his life. Like many people caught in cycles of domestic turmoil, George had a complicated history with the law, having been arrested multiple times for various offenses. But on this February night, he was simply a man spending time with his girlfriend Sarah Boone in their shared apartment, drinking and trying to have what they would later describe as fun. Sarah Boone, also 42, had been in a relationship with George for some time. Their relationship was turbulent, marked by arguments, reconciliations, and the kind of push-and-pull dynamic that often characterizes couples trapped in unhealthy patterns. Friends and family members would later describe their relationship as volatile, with both partners contributing to a cycle of conflict that seemed to escalate over time. That evening started like many others for the couple. They had been drinking, and as the night wore on, they decided to engage in what Sarah would later claim was a game of hide and seek. This wasn't entirely unusual for them, adults engaging in playful activities while under the influence isn't uncommon, though the specific nature of their game would prove to be anything but innocent fun. According to Sarah's account, George suggested that he hide inside a suitcase. It was a large blue suitcase, big enough for a person to fit inside if they curled up tightly. The idea, she claimed, was that it would be amusing, a silly way to spend their evening. George allegedly climbed inside the suitcase willingly, folding himself into the confined space with the kind of flexibility that such an act would require. What happened next would become the central question in a murder trial that wouldn't conclude until October 2024, nearly 4.5 years later. Sarah zipped the suitcase closed with George inside. But rather than quickly opening it again as part of their supposed game, something else occurred, something that would transform a night of drinking and playing into a nightmare that would end with George's death. The most chilling aspect of this case emerged from evidence that Sarah herself created. Rather than immediately releasing George from the suitcase, Sarah took out her phone and began recording videos. These videos, which would become crucial evidence in her eventual trial, painted a disturbing picture of what truly happened in those final hours of George's life. In the footage, which was played for the jury during Sarah's trial, George can be heard calling Sarah's name from inside the suitcase. His voice, muffled by the fabric and zipper, carries an increasingly desperate tone as he realizes he cannot get out. "Sarah, Sarah," he calls, his voice becoming more strained as time passes. The videos show Sarah responding, but not with concern or urgency. Instead, she appears to be taunting him. "That's what you get," she can be heard saying in one video. "That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." The recordings capture a conversation between them, with George trapped and Sarah in complete control of his situation. She references their relationship problems, his alleged infidelities, and seems to view his predicament as some form of poetic justice for perceived wrongs he had committed against her. As the videos continue, George's pleas become more desperate. He tells Sarah he can't breathe properly, that he needs to get out. The enclosed space of the suitcase, combined with the physical stress of being folded into such a confined position, was making breathing increasingly difficult. But instead of releasing him, Sarah continued to record, continued to talk to him through the fabric barrier that separated them. The medical evidence would later show that George was experiencing the early stages of asphyxiation. The human body requires a constant supply of fresh oxygen, and the enclosed space of the suitcase, especially with a person sealed inside, quickly becomes depleted of breathable air. Carbon dioxide builds up, creating a toxic environment that becomes increasingly dangerous with each passing minute. But perhaps most disturbing was the fact that at some point during this ordeal, Sarah made a decision that would prove fatal. Rather than opening the suitcase and releasing Jorge, she left him inside and went upstairs to bed. According to her own admission to police, she zipped her boyfriend into a suitcase and then went to sleep, leaving him trapped and unable to escape. The apartment fell silent except for whatever sounds George may have made trying to free himself from his fabric prison. The suitcase, now his tomb, sat in the downstairs area while Sarah slept above. Hours passed, crucial hours during which George's oxygen supply dwindled and his ability to survive diminished with each breath. What George experienced during those dark hours can only be imagined. Trapped in complete darkness, his body contorted into an unnatural position, his breathing becoming more labored as the available oxygen was consumed and replaced with carbon dioxide. The psychological terror of his situation must have been overwhelming, trapped by someone he trusted, unable to escape, slowly realizing that his life was slipping away. The physical evidence would later tell the story of George's final hours. The medical examiner found scratches on his back and neck, evidence of his desperate attempts to free himself from the suitcase. There were bruises on his shoulder, skull, and forehead, described as blunt force trauma, from his struggles against the confines of his prison. A cut was found on his lip, likely from his frantic efforts to escape or call for help. As the night stretched into the early hours of February 24th, George Torres Jr. took his final breath inside that blue suitcase. The cause of death would be determined to be asphyxiation, death from lack of oxygen. He had suffocated slowly, trapped and alone, while the woman who claimed to love him slept peacefully upstairs. When Sarah woke up the following morning, she went downstairs and opened the suitcase. What she found was George's lifeless body, his skin discolored from the lack of oxygen. According to her later testimony, she was shocked by his condition. "He's purple," she would tell first responders when she called 911. The 911 call that Sarah made on the morning of February 24th would become another crucial piece of evidence in understanding what really happened. In the recording, she sounds distressed as she reports finding George dead in the suitcase. But her explanation for how he got there raised immediate red flags for investigators. Sarah told the 911 operator that they had been playing hide and seek, that George had gotten into the suitcase voluntarily as part of their game. She claimed that she had fallen asleep and only discovered his body when she woke up and opened the suitcase. Her story was that it had been a tragic accident, an unforeseeable consequence of what was supposed to be innocent fun between two adults. When paramedics arrived at the Winter Park apartment, they found a scene that immediately struck them as suspicious. George's body was indeed inside the suitcase, but the circumstances didn't align with the story Sarah was telling. The physical evidence suggested something far more sinister than a game gone wrong. The Orange County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation, and detectives began the careful process of documenting the scene and gathering evidence. What they found painted a picture that contradicted Sarah's account of accidental death during innocent play. First, there were the videos on Sarah's phone. These recordings provided a window into what had actually occurred during George's final hours, and they told a story very different from the one Sarah had presented to emergency responders. The videos showed that she had been aware George was in distress, that he had been calling for help, and that rather than assisting him, she had continued to record and, according to the audio, seemed to be enjoying his predicament. The physical evidence from George's body also contradicted the accident narrative. The scratches and bruises suggested a prolonged struggle, not the peaceful death one might expect from someone who simply fell asleep during a game. The medical examiner's findings indicated that George had fought desperately to free himself, that his death had been neither quick nor peaceful. Detective interviews with neighbors and acquaintances revealed the troubled nature of Sarah and George's relationship. Multiple sources described a pattern of arguments, accusations, and volatile interactions between the couple. There were reports of previous domestic incidents, suggestions that their relationship was marked by jealousy, mistrust, and emotional manipulation. On February 25, 2020, just one day after George's body was discovered, Sarah Boone was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The charge reflected investigators' belief that while Sarah may not have intended to kill George when she first zipped him into the suitcase, her subsequent actions, particularly her decision to leave him trapped overnight while she slept, demonstrated a depraved indifference to human life that constituted murder under Florida law. Sarah's initial reaction to her arrest was one of apparent disbelief. She maintained her innocence, insisting that George's death had been an accident and that she had never intended for him to be harmed. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and the videos she had recorded herself provided prosecutors with a smoking gun that would be difficult to explain away. The legal proceedings that followed George's death would prove to be almost as unusual as the crime itself. Sarah Boone's case became notable not just for the bizarre nature of the murder, but for the chaotic series of events that characterized her path to trial. One of the most remarkable aspects of Sarah's case was her relationship with legal counsel. Over the course of more than 4 years between her arrest and trial, Sarah went through at least 8 different attorneys. This unprecedented turnover in legal representation was due largely to Sarah's own behavior and demands. Sarah developed a pattern of writing extensive letters to judges, court personnel, and her attorneys, often containing complaints, demands, and increasingly erratic requests. She would frequently disagree with her lawyers' strategies, accuse them of inadequate representation, and request to represent herself or to have new counsel appointed. This created a cycle where attorneys would withdraw from her case, citing irreconcilable differences or ethical concerns about continuing representation. The correspondence that Sarah sent from jail while awaiting trial provided insight into her mental state and her perspective on the charges against her. Rather than showing remorse for George's death or accepting responsibility for her role in it, her letters often focused on her own perceived victimization by the legal system, the media, and even George himself. In these communications, Sarah continued to maintain that she was the real victim in the situation. She portrayed George as abusive and herself as someone who had been defending herself against his aggression. This narrative would eventually become the foundation of her defense strategy when she finally went to trial. While Sarah cycled through attorneys and wrote letter after letter from her jail cell, George's family was left to grieve and seek justice for their loved one. His relatives spoke about a man who, despite his flaws and legal troubles, had been someone's son, someone's family member, someone whose life had value and meaning. The impact of George's death extended beyond his immediate family to the broader Winter Park community. The bizarre nature of the crime and the subsequent legal proceedings drew significant media attention, turning what might have been a local tragedy into a nationally followed case. As the years passed and Sarah's trial date was repeatedly delayed due to attorney changes and legal maneuvering, public interest in the case grew. True crime enthusiasts followed the developments through court filings and media reports, fascinated by both the unusual method of murder and the defendant's increasingly erratic behavior. Finally, in October 2024, nearly 4.5 years after George's death, Sarah Boone faced a jury of her peers in an Orange County courtroom. The trial that had been delayed so many times due to her legal representation issues was finally ready to proceed. The prosecution's case was built around the physical evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and most importantly, the videos that Sarah herself had recorded. Prosecutors argued that while the initial decision to zip George into the suitcase might have been part of some twisted game or argument between the couple, Sarah's actions after that point demonstrated a clear intent to harm him or, at minimum, a depraved indifference to his life and safety. The videos were played for the jury, allowing them to hear George's increasingly desperate pleas for help and Sarah's responses, which showed no concern for his welfare. The prosecution emphasized that Sarah had multiple opportunities to release George from the suitcase, that she was clearly aware he was in distress, and that her decision to go to sleep while leaving him trapped demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The medical testimony was equally damning. The medical examiner explained to the jury how asphyxiation works, how long the process typically takes, and what George would have experienced during his final hours. The scratches and bruises on his body told a story of desperate struggle, of a man fighting for his life against an impossible situation. Sarah's defense strategy centered around claims of self-defense and battered woman syndrome. Her attorneys argued that George had been abusive toward her, both physically and emotionally, and that her actions on the night of his death were motivated by fear and self-preservation rather than malice. During the trial, Sarah took the stand in her own defense, a risky decision that allowed prosecutors to cross-examine her directly about her actions and motivations. Her testimony lasted several hours and provided the public with its first opportunity to hear her account of events in detail. Speaking in a soft voice, Sarah described her relationship with George as abusive and controlling. She claimed that he had physically assaulted her on multiple occasions and that she lived in constant fear of his violent outbursts. According to her testimony, the events of February 23 began as George becoming aggressive and threatening toward her. Sarah told the jury that George had been drinking heavily that evening and had become increasingly agitated. She claimed that when he got into the suitcase, it wasn't as part of a game but rather as part of a confrontation between them. She testified that she feared for her safety and that zipping him into the suitcase was a way to protect herself from his aggression. However, Sarah's testimony was immediately undermined by the videos she had recorded. The audio clearly showed her taunting George rather than responding to him as a threat. Her comments about cheating and relationship problems suggested personal grievances rather than fear-based self-defense. Most damaging was her decision to record the interaction at all, behavior that seemed incompatible with someone in fear for their life. The prosecution's cross-examination of Sarah was methodical and devastating. They walked her through each video, asking her to explain specific comments she had made and actions she had taken. They questioned why, if she truly feared Jorge, she had chosen to record him rather than call police or flee the apartment. Perhaps most importantly, prosecutors focused on Sarah's decision to go to sleep while George remained trapped in the suitcase. They argued that even if her initial actions could be explained by fear or self-defense, her choice to leave him overnight demonstrated a conscious disregard for his life that constituted murder. The trial included testimony from various experts, including domestic violence specialists who explained the dynamics of abusive relationships and how victims sometimes react in unexpected ways. However, these experts also noted that Sarah's behavior and the evidence in the case didn't align with typical patterns seen in legitimate self-defense situations. After hearing all the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate on Sarah's fate. The central question they faced was whether Sarah's actions constituted murder, as prosecutors claimed, or whether they fell into some lesser category of homicide or even justifiable self-defense, as the defense argued. The jury's deliberation lasted several hours as they carefully reviewed the evidence, including the disturbing videos that captured George's final moments of life. They had to weigh Sarah's claims of abuse and self-defense against the physical evidence and her own recorded behavior during George's death. On October 25, 2024, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict reflected their belief that while Sarah may not have premeditated George's death, her actions demonstrated a depraved mind and callous disregard for human life that constituted murder under Florida law. Sarah showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the composed demeanor she had displayed throughout much of the trial. The conviction carried a potential sentence of life in prison, though the exact punishment would be determined during a separate sentencing hearing. The guilty verdict was met with satisfaction from George's family members, who had waited nearly 5 years for justice. They spoke about the impact of his death on their lives and their relief that Sarah would finally be held accountable for her actions. During the sentencing phase of the proceedings, several of George's family members provided victim impact statements, describing the man they had lost and the ongoing pain caused by his death. They painted a picture of someone who, despite his flaws, had been loved and valued by those who knew him. Sarah's attorneys presented mitigating factors, including her lack of prior violent offenses and her claims of having been abused. However, the judge ultimately concluded that the nature of the crime and the evidence of Sarah's behavior during George's death warranted the maximum penalty available. On December 2, 2024, Sarah Boone was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars for her role in George Torres Jr.'s death. The judge's sentencing statement reflected the court's view that Sarah's actions represented a particularly egregious form of domestic violence, where the power dynamic between partners was exploited to inflict ultimate harm. The unusual nature of the murder, using a suitcase as a weapon, made the case particularly disturbing and memorable. The conclusion of Sarah Boone's case marked the end of a legal saga that had stretched across nearly 5 years and captivated true crime followers across the nation. The bizarre nature of the murder method, combined with Sarah's erratic behavior during the legal proceedings, had made it one of the most unusual criminal cases in recent Florida history. For George Torres Jr.'s family, the life sentence represented a measure of justice, though it could never bring back their loved one or erase the traumatic circumstances of his death. They expressed hope that the case might serve as a warning about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs before relationships escalate to deadly violence. The case also highlighted broader issues about domestic violence and the complex dynamics that can exist between intimate partners. While Sarah claimed to be a victim of abuse, the evidence suggested that she had ultimately become the perpetrator of the most serious form of domestic violence possible, murder. The use of a suitcase as a murder weapon was particularly disturbing because it represented such a prolonged and intimate form of killing. Unlike a shooting or stabbing, which can occur in moments of passion or sudden violence, George's death required sustained action and deliberate choices by Sarah over a period of hours. The videos that Sarah recorded during George's death remain some of the most chilling evidence ever presented in a murder trial. They provided a real-time documentation of a man's final hours and a woman's apparent indifference to his suffering. The fact that Sarah chose to create this evidence herself speaks to either a profound lack of understanding about the seriousness of her actions or a disturbing comfort with documenting another person's death. True crime analysts and legal experts have used the case as an example of how domestic violence can escalate in unexpected ways and how the dynamics of power and control in abusive relationships can lead to deadly outcomes. The case serves as a reminder that domestic violence affects people of all backgrounds and can manifest in ways that are difficult to predict or prevent. The Winter Park community, where George's death occurred, was left to grapple with the reality that such a bizarre and violent crime had taken place in their quiet suburb. The case served as a sobering reminder that domestic violence and murder can occur anywhere, in any community, and often behind closed doors where neighbors and friends may be unaware of the dangers. As Sarah Boone begins her life sentence, she joins the ranks of individuals whose crimes were so unusual and disturbing that they become part of true crime history. Her name will forever be associated with one of the most bizarre murder methods ever documented, and her case will likely be studied and discussed by criminologists, legal experts, and true crime enthusiasts for years to come. George Torres Jr., meanwhile, is remembered not just as a victim of an unusual murder, but as a person whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of his death. His family's statements during the trial painted a picture of someone who struggled with his own demons but who was still deserving of life, dignity, and the chance to overcome his challenges. The suitcase murder case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly domestic situations can turn deadly. It illustrates the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships, seeking help when needed, and understanding that domestic violence can escalate to murder in ways that no one anticipates. In the quiet hours of that February night in 2020, George Torres Jr. experienced a death that no one should ever endure, trapped, terrified, and slowly suffocating while the person he trusted most in the world chose to document his suffering rather than save his life. His story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the darkest possibilities that exist within human relationships and the importance of treating every life with the dignity and respect that George was denied in his final hours. The case of George Torres Jr. and Sarah Boone will be remembered not just for its unusual circumstances, but for the broader questions it raises about domestic violence, justice, and the complex dynamics that can exist between people who claim to love each other. It stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how trust can be weaponized and how ordinary objects, even something as mundane as a suitcase, can become instruments of death in the hands of someone who chooses cruelty over compassion. As this story comes to its close, we're left to contemplate the choices that led to George's death and the justice that finally came for Sarah Boone. It's a case that reminds us that truth often emerges, even when buried beneath lies and deception, and that accountability, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. In the end, George Torres Jr. received the justice he deserved, and Sarah Boone received the punishment that fit her crime. The suitcase that became George's tomb now serves as evidence of human cruelty, while the videos Sarah recorded stand as testimony to her guilt and a permanent record of one man's final, desperate fight for life. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. On a warm June evening in Mesa, Arizona, in 2008, friends of Travis Alexander began to worry. The 30-year-old motivational speaker and successful businessman had missed an important conference call, something completely out of character for the ambitious young man who had built his life around helping others achieve their dreams. Travis Alexander wasn't just any ordinary resident of Mesa. He was the kind of person who drew people in with his magnetic personality and unwavering optimism. Standing tall with dark hair and an infectious smile, Travis had transformed himself from a troubled childhood into a beacon of inspiration for others. He worked as a sales representative for Prepaid Legal Services, a multi-level marketing company, but his true passion lay in motivational speaking. His friends often described him as someone who could light up any room he entered. Travis had recently finished writing a self-help book, pouring his experiences and wisdom into pages that he hoped would inspire others to overcome their own obstacles. He was a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and his faith wasn't just a Sunday affair, it permeated every aspect of his life, from his business dealings to his personal relationships. But on June 9, 2008, when Travis failed to show up for a planned business trip to Cancun, Mexico, his friends knew something was terribly wrong. They had been trying to reach him for days, calling his phone repeatedly, only to hear it ring endlessly into voicemail. The Travis they knew would never simply disappear without a word, especially not when business commitments were involved. Concerned friends decided to check on him at his home in Mesa. What they discovered would shatter their world and launch one of the most captivating and disturbing murder cases in recent American history. When they entered Travis's house that evening, using a spare key, the scene that greeted them was beyond comprehension. Travis Alexander lay dead in his master bathroom shower, his body showing signs of an attack so brutal that it defied understanding. The medical examiner would later determine that he had suffered 27 stab wounds, a slit throat so deep it nearly severed his head, and a single gunshot wound to his forehead. The violence was not random, it was personal, intimate, and filled with a rage that spoke to something far more complex than a simple burglary gone wrong. Nothing appeared to be stolen from the house. Travis's wallet, electronics, and other valuables remained untouched. This was not the work of a stranger. As investigators processed the horrific crime scene, they began piecing together the final days of Travis Alexander's life. They discovered that on June 4, the day medical examiners determined he had been killed, Travis had not been alone. Digital evidence from his camera, including deleted photos that forensic experts were able to recover, painted a disturbing picture of his final hours. The photos, recovered from a camera found in Travis's washing machine, told a story that would become central to the case. They showed Travis and a young woman together in intimate moments, time-stamped throughout the day of June 4th. The final photos were particularly chilling, accidental shots that appeared to show Travis in distress, followed by images of what looked like his body being dragged across the bathroom floor. The woman in those photos was someone Travis's friends knew well, though many had grown to dislike and distrust her, Jodi and Arias. 28-year-old Jodi Arias had entered Travis's life nearly 2 years earlier, in September 2006, at a prepaid legal services conference in Las Vegas. On the surface, she seemed to be everything that might appeal to someone like Travis. She was attractive, with long brown hair and striking features, and she appeared interested in the same business opportunities that drove his ambitions. But Jodi was a study in contradictions. Born and raised in Salinas, California, she had drifted through various jobs, waitressing, photography, retail work, without ever seeming to find her true calling. She was intelligent and articulate, yet there was something about her that made people uncomfortable, though they often couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. When Jodi and Travis met at that Las Vegas conference, the attraction appeared to be immediate and intense. Travis, despite his Mormon faith's emphasis on chastity before marriage, found himself drawn into a passionate relationship that would challenge his religious convictions and ultimately cost him his life. Their relationship was complicated from the start. Travis was deeply committed to his Mormon faith, but Jodi represented temptation in a way that he seemed unable to resist. Friends later described their relationship as intoxicating but toxic, filled with incredible highs and devastating lows. Travis would break up with Jodi, only to reconcile days or weeks later, drawn back by what seemed to be an almost magnetic pull. In an effort to make their relationship work within the context of his faith, Travis encouraged Jodi to convert to Mormonism. In November 2006, just months after they met, Jodi was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She threw herself into the conversion with the same intensity that seemed to characterize everything she did, learning about Mormon doctrine and participating in church activities. But the conversion didn't solve the fundamental problems in their relationship. If anything, it seemed to make things more complicated. Travis struggled with the conflict between his physical desires and his religious beliefs, while Jodi appeared to use his faith both as a way to get closer to him and as a weapon against him when things went wrong. Friends began to notice troubling patterns in Jodi's behavior almost from the beginning. She seemed to have an unusual need to know where Travis was at all times, calling him repeatedly throughout the day and becoming upset when he didn't answer immediately. She would show up at places where Travis was supposed to be, claiming coincidence but appearing to have deliberately sought him out. Even more concerning was the way Jodi seemed to change herself to match whatever she thought Travis wanted. She adopted his interests, mimicked his speech patterns, and began to dress differently. It was as if she was trying to become the perfect woman for him, but the effort felt calculated rather than genuine. In 2007, Jodi made a decision that would later prove significant. She moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, to be closer to Travis. She rented a house and tried to build a life in his hometown, but Travis seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her proximity. He began to pull back from the relationship, creating distance that only seemed to intensify Jodi's efforts to maintain their connection. The more Travis tried to establish boundaries, the more invasive Jodi's behavior became. She would let herself into his house uninvited, using a knowledge of where he kept spare keys. She hacked into his email accounts and social media profiles, monitoring his communications with other people. Friends reported seeing her hiding in bushes near his house and following him to social events where she hadn't been invited. Travis confided in close friends that he was becoming frightened of Jodi, though he seemed unable to completely cut ties with her. There were reports of slashed tires on his car, mysterious incidents where his possessions went missing, and a growing sense among his inner circle that Jodi represented a real danger. In early 2008, Travis began dating other women more seriously, signaling to friends that he was finally ready to move on from his tumultuous relationship with Jodi. But instead of accepting this reality, Jodi seemed to become more desperate and erratic. She continued to try to maintain an intimate relationship with Travis, even as he was pursuing other romantic interests. The situation came to a head in the spring of 2008. Travis had planned a vacation to Cancun with a new girlfriend, a trip that represented his attempt to build a healthy, stable relationship with someone who shared his values and faith. But Jodi couldn't let go. On June 2, 2008, just 2 days before Travis was murdered, Jodi rented a car in Redding, California. What happened next would become a central focus of the investigation and subsequent trial. According to phone records and gas station receipts, Jodi began a marathon drive from California to Arizona, a journey that she would later claim never happened. But the evidence told a different story. Jodi had rented a white Ford Focus, telling the rental agency that she planned to visit friends in the area. Instead, according to prosecutors, she embarked on a carefully planned mission of revenge. She drove through the night, stopping to buy gas cans, a detail that would later prove crucial to the case, and arrived in Mesa, Arizona, sometime on June 3. What exactly transpired between Jodi's arrival in Mesa and the discovery of Travis's body remains partially shrouded in mystery, but the evidence suggests a complex and disturbing series of events. The recovered photos from Travis's camera show that on June 4, he and Jodi spent time together in his house, engaging in intimate activities that were captured in digital images. These photos, taken throughout the afternoon of June 4, show what appears to be a normal, even romantic encounter between two people who had shared an intimate history. Travis appears relaxed and happy in the images, showing no sign that he suspected what was about to happen. But something changed dramatically in those final hours. The last intentional photos of Travis alive show him in his shower, apparently unaware that his life was about to end. Then, at 5:29 p.m., the camera captured what appear to be accidental photos, blurry, chaotic images that seem to document the attack itself. One photo shows Travis on the bathroom floor, looking up with what appears to be a look of shock and terror. Another shows what looks like a foot in jeans and a sock, suggesting someone standing over him. The final image appears to show Travis's body being dragged across the floor, leaving a trail of blood that would later be analyzed by forensic experts. The attack was savage and prolonged. Medical examiners determined that Travis had been stabbed 27 times, with wounds to his back, chest, and hands suggesting that he had tried desperately to defend himself. His throat had been slashed with such force that it cut through his trachea and nearly severed his head from his body. Finally, he had been shot in the forehead with a .25 caliber bullet. The sequence of these injuries became a point of contention during the trial, with prosecutors arguing that the gunshot came last, as a final act of rage or desperation, while the defense claimed it came first and that the stabbing was a response to Travis continuing to attack even after being shot. What was undisputed was the brutality of the attack and the personal nature of the violence. This wasn't a quick killing, it was prolonged torture that spoke to an incredible level of anger and hatred. The wound suggested that Travis had fought for his life, but ultimately had been overwhelmed by his attacker. After the killing, according to prosecutors, Jodi attempted to clean up the crime scene. She washed Travis's body and dragged it back into the shower, perhaps hoping that running water would wash away evidence. She put the camera in the washing machine, likely hoping to destroy the digital evidence, not knowing that modern forensics would be able to recover deleted files from the memory card. But despite these efforts, Jodi left behind a wealth of evidence. A palm print in blood at the scene contained both her DNA and Travis's. Hair evidence and other forensic materials would later tie her conclusively to the crime scene. After the murder, Jodi attempted to establish an alibi. She drove back to California, stopping to see another romantic interest and acting as though nothing had happened. She went to work, attended social events, and gave every appearance of being a woman going about her normal life. When Travis's body was discovered and news of his death spread, Jodi played the role of the grieving ex-girlfriend. She sent flowers to his funeral, spoke tearfully about their relationship, and appeared genuinely shocked and saddened by his death. She even spoke to detectives, portraying herself as someone who had loved Travis and would never hurt him. But investigators were already suspicious. Jodi's story about her whereabouts during the time of the murder kept changing, and physical evidence began to contradict her claims. The rental car she had used showed signs of having been cleaned extensively, and there were questions about why she had driven so far out of her way during her alleged trip to visit friends. On July 15, 2008, just over a month after Travis's body was discovered, Jodi Arias was arrested at her grandparents' home in California and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest came after weeks of investigation had built a compelling case against her, though she continued to maintain her innocence. Initially, Jodi claimed she had never been to Travis's house that day and knew nothing about his murder. But as evidence mounted against her, including the photographic evidence and DNA analysis, her story began to evolve in ways that would become a hallmark of the case. First, she claimed she hadn't been in Arizona at all during the time of the murder. When phone records and gas receipts proved this was false, she admitted to being in the area but claimed she had never seen Travis. When the photos from his camera were recovered, showing her clearly with him on the day he died, she changed her story again. In her next version of events, Jodi claimed that she had indeed been at Travis's house, but that they had been attacked by intruders, two masked assailants who had killed Travis while she managed to escape. This story, too, fell apart under scrutiny from investigators who found no evidence of any other perpetrators. Finally, as her trial approached, Jodi settled on the story that would become her defense. She had killed Travis, but only in self-defense after he became violent and tried to kill her first. The trial, which began in January 2013, became a media sensation unlike any in recent memory. The combination of sex, religion, violence, and a photogenic defendant created a perfect storm of public fascination that would dominate news cycles for months. Prosecutor Juan Martinez, known for his aggressive courtroom style, laid out a case that portrayed Jodi as a jealous, obsessed woman who had planned Travis's murder meticulously. He argued that she had killed him in a rage because he was planning to take another woman to Cancun and had finally decided to cut ties with her completely. The prosecution's case was built around the physical evidence, the DNA, the photos, the rental car records, but also around testimony from Travis's friends who described Jodi's increasingly erratic and threatening behavior in the months leading up to the murder. The defense, led by Kirk Nermi and Jennifer Wilmot, presented a dramatically different picture of Travis Alexander. They portrayed him as someone who had used Jodi sexually while publicly disparaging her, claiming that he had been verbally and physically abusive and that their relationship had been built on his exploitation of her devotion to him. Jodi herself took the stand for 18 days, an unusually long testimony that riveted viewers and provided insight into her mindset and personality. She described in graphic detail the alleged abuse she claimed to have suffered at Travis's hands, painting herself as a victim who had finally snapped when faced with a life-or-death situation. But her testimony was filled with inconsistencies and moments that seemed to undermine her credibility. She appeared to have an extraordinary memory for details that supported her version of events, while claiming to have gaps in her memory about crucial moments during the attack itself. One of the most dramatic moments in her testimony came when she described the actual killing. She claimed that Travis had become enraged when she dropped his new camera, and that he had attacked her violently. In the ensuing struggle, she said, she had managed to get to a gun that Travis kept in his bedroom and had shot him in self-defense. But her description of the events didn't match the physical evidence. The prosecution argued that if she had shot Travis first, as she claimed, he would have been incapacitated and unable to continue attacking her. The defensive wounds on his hands and the nature of the stab wound suggested a prolonged struggle, not the quick self-defense scenario she described. Perhaps most damaging to her case was her demeanor during the testimony. While she spoke about allegedly horrific abuse and a life-or-death struggle, she often appeared calm and detached, almost clinical in her descriptions. There were moments when she seemed to be performing rather than remembering, and her responses to questions sometimes seemed calculated to create maximum sympathy rather than simply tell the truth. The trial also delved deep into the intimate details of Travis and Jody's relationship, including recorded phone calls and text messages that revealed the complicated nature of their sexual relationship. These revelations were particularly uncomfortable for Travis's family and friends, who felt that his reputation was being unfairly attacked when he couldn't defend himself. One piece of evidence that proved particularly compelling was a phone sex recording that Jody had made without Travis's knowledge. The defense used it to show the sexual nature of their relationship and to argue that Travis was manipulating her, while the prosecution argued that it demonstrated Jody's deceptive and invasive behavior. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was about much more than just determining guilt or innocence. It was a battle over the narrative of Travis Alexander's life and character, and a psychological study of someone whose behavior seemed to defy easy explanation. The prosecution painted Jody as a master manipulator who had constructed elaborate lies and carefully planned Travis's murder. They argued that her decision to drive to Arizona with gas cans was evidence of premeditation. She wanted to avoid leaving a paper trail of gas station purchases that might place her at the scene. The defense countered that Jody was a damaged woman who had been psychologically and physically abused, and who had acted in desperation rather than calculated malice. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about domestic violence and trauma, arguing that Jody's behavior fit the pattern of an abuse victim. But there were aspects of the case that seemed to contradict both narratives. The extreme violence of the attack suggested rage rather than self-defense, but it also seemed to go beyond what might be expected from a simple murder-for-hire scenario. The personal nature of the wounds, particularly the throat slashing, suggested someone who was deeply emotionally invested in causing Travis pain. On May 8, 2013, after deliberating for more than 15 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. They rejected Jody's claim of self-defense and accepted the prosecution's argument that she had planned and carried out Travis's murder deliberately. But the verdict was just the beginning of another phase of the trial. In Arizona, a first-degree murder conviction can carry the death penalty, and the same jury that had found Jody guilty now had to decide whether she should live or die. The penalty phase of the trial was even more emotional than the guilt phase, with Travis's family members taking the stand to describe the impact of his death on their lives. His siblings spoke tearfully about losing not just a brother, but someone who had been a father figure and mentor to many of them. Jody's family also testified, pleading for her life and describing the woman they knew as kind and caring, someone who didn't deserve to die for her actions. The contrast between these testimonies and the evidence of the brutal murder created a surreal atmosphere in the courtroom. In a shocking move, Jody herself addressed the jury during the penalty phase, asking them to sentence her to life in prison rather than death. She spoke about her desire to help other inmates, to contribute something positive to society even from behind bars. But her presentation seemed to many observers to be another performance, carefully calculated to save her own life. The jury, however, was unable to reach a unanimous decision on sentencing. After deliberating for more than 13 hours, they declared themselves deadlocked, leading to a mistrial in the penalty phase. This meant that a new jury would have to be selected to decide Jody's fate. The second penalty phase, which began in October 2014, was a shorter affair but no less dramatic. A new jury heard abbreviated versions of the same arguments about whether Jody Arias deserved to live or die for her crimes. But once again, the jury couldn't reach unanimity. In March 2015, they too declared themselves deadlocked on the death penalty question. Under Arizona law, this meant that the death penalty was off the table, and Jody would be sentenced to life in prison. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Jody Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted the particularly cruel nature of the crime and the suffering that Travis had endured, but acknowledged that the failure of two juries to agree on the death penalty meant that life imprisonment was the only option. For Travis Alexander's family, the end of the trial brought some measure of closure, but also continued pain. They had endured years of legal proceedings, during which Travis's character and reputation had been repeatedly attacked. They had been forced to relive the details of his brutal murder over and over again, and to sit in the same room as the woman who had killed him. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of intimate relationships and the warning signs of dangerous obsession. Travis's friends have spoken about their regrets, their wish that they had done more to protect him from someone they increasingly saw as a threat. But the case also highlighted the complexities of human relationships and the difficulty of predicting when someone might cross the line from obsession to violence. Jodi Arias had no history of violent crime, no obvious red flags that might have predicted her capacity for such brutality. Today, Jodi Arias remains in prison in Arizona, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. She has largely disappeared from public view, though she occasionally grants interviews or makes statements through her legal representatives. The Travis Alexander case serves as a reminder of how quickly a life can be destroyed, and how the consequences of one person's actions can ripple out to affect countless others. Travis was just 30 years old when he died, with his whole future ahead of him. His family, friends, and the countless people he might have inspired through his motivational speaking were all robbed of what he might have become. The case also raises questions about justice and whether the legal system can ever truly account for the full impact of such a brutal crime. Jodi Arias will spend the rest of her life in prison, but Travis Alexander's life can never be restored, and the trauma inflicted on his loved ones can never be fully healed. In the end, the murder of Travis Alexander stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how love can turn to obsession, and obsession to deadly violence. It's a reminder that the people closest to us can sometimes pose the greatest danger, and that the warning signs of that danger are not always as clear as we might hope them to be. The case captured the public imagination not just because of its salacious details, but because it forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that can lurk beneath an ordinary exterior. In trying to understand what drove Jodi Arias to commit such a brutal act, we are forced to examine the darkest corners of human psychology and the mysterious alchemy that can transform love into hate. As we reflect on this tragic story, we're reminded of the fragility of life and the importance of recognizing and respecting the boundaries that keep us all safe. Travis Alexander's story ended in violence and tragedy, but his memory lives on in the people who loved him and in the reminder that every life has value, every person deserves to feel safe, and every relationship should be built on respect rather than possession. The case of Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias will likely continue to fascinate and disturb people for years to come, not because it offers easy answers, but because it forces us to confront the most troubling questions about love, obsession, and the capacity for evil that exists within the human heart. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're going to explore a deeply tragic case that shook the small community of Alton, Illinois in the summer of 2022. This is the story of Lise Dodd, a young woman whose life was cut short in the most unimaginable way, just weeks before she was to become a mother. As always, we approach these stories with respect for the victims and their families. This case contains disturbing content, so please take care of yourself as we journey through this difficult tale together. Our story takes place in Alton, Illinois, a historic river town nestled along the Mississippi River, about 20 miles north of St. Louis. With a population of just over 25,000 people, Alton is the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where news travels fast, and where violent crime feels like something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. The town has seen its share of history. It was once a stop on the Underground Railroad, and later became known for its limestone quarries and river commerce. By 2022, it had settled into the rhythm of a typical Midwest community, where the most exciting news might be a high school football game or a new business opening downtown. It was into this quiet setting that 22-year-old Lise Dodd had recently moved, carrying with her hopes for a new beginning and the anticipation of motherhood. She was 8 months pregnant, her body round with the promise of new life, just weeks away from holding her first child in her arms. To understand what happened to Lise, we need to go back about 2 years, to when she first met DeAndrea Holloway. Their relationship began like many do, with attraction, shared moments, and the possibility of something lasting. But from the beginning, it was marked by instability. Those who knew them described their connection as on again, off again, a pattern that had persisted for nearly 2 years. These types of relationships can be emotionally exhausting, characterized by passionate reunions followed by dramatic separations, creating a cycle that can be difficult to break. Holloway was 25 years old in 2022, 3 years older than Lise. Friends and family later recalled that the relationship had been tumultuous, with periods of separation where both would try to move on, only to find themselves drawn back together again. This push and pull dynamic would prove to be more than just emotionally damaging, it would become deadly. By early 2022, Lise had made a decision that many people in complicated relationships eventually make: she was going to start fresh. She moved to Alton, perhaps hoping that the change of scenery would help her break free from the cyclical pattern of her relationship with Holloway. But life, as it often does, had complicated her plans. She was pregnant, 8 months along, and while sources indicate the child may not have been Holloway's, the connection between them remained. Pregnancy can be a time of vulnerability, when a woman needs support and stability. Instead, Lise found herself navigating single motherhood in a new town, with the father of her unborn child's future uncertain. As June 2022 progressed, Lise was in the final stretch of her pregnancy. At 8 months, she would have been feeling the weight of her growing child, experiencing the discomfort and anticipation that comes with the last weeks before birth. She was preparing for one of life's most significant transitions, from woman to mother. Her mother, whose name has been kept private out of respect for the family, maintained regular contact with her daughter during this crucial time. This is natural for any mother, but especially so when your child is about to become a parent themselves. Phone calls, text messages, check-ins, these small connections become lifelines during important life transitions. But as the days passed, something changed. The regular communication that Lisa's mother had come to expect began to fade. A day without hearing from her pregnant daughter turned into 2 days, then more. For a mother, this silence would have been deafening. When you have a child, especially one who is about to give birth, every missed call becomes a worry. Every unanswered text message feeds a growing anxiety that something might be wrong. Lisa's mother tried calling again and again. She sent messages. She waited for responses that never came. The maternal instinct that something was terribly wrong grew stronger with each passing hour. Unable to shake her growing concern, Lisa's mother made the decision that any worried parent would make: she would go check on her daughter in person. The drive to Alton might have felt endless, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Maybe Lisa's phone had died. Maybe she was in early labor and couldn't respond. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But as any parent knows, when you can't reach your child, your mind automatically goes to the worst-case scenarios. The mother's intuition that had been nagging at her was about to be proven devastatingly correct. When she arrived at Lisa's apartment on Bolivar Street, the building would have looked normal from the outside. Nothing to suggest the horror that waited inside. She probably knocked first, called out her daughter's name, waited for the sound of footsteps or a voice calling back. Silence. Using whatever means necessary, perhaps a spare key, perhaps with the help of a landlord or neighbor, she gained entry to the apartment. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her daughter, 8 months pregnant with her first grandchild, was dead. But this wasn't a natural death, or even a typical homicide. This was something far worse, something that would shock even experienced investigators. Lise had been decapitated. The discovery was so horrific, so beyond anything a mother should ever have to see, that it defies adequate description. Imagine the woman who had brought Lise into this world, who had watched her take her first steps, speak her first words, graduate from school, now faced with a scene of such brutality that it would challenge anyone's faith in humanity. When the Alton Police Department received the call, they knew immediately that this was not going to be an ordinary case. Homicides in Alton were rare enough, but this level of violence was unprecedented in their community. Police Chief Marcos Pulido, a veteran officer who had seen his share of difficult cases, would later describe the scene in terms that revealed just how deeply it had affected him and his officers. In a video posted to the department's Facebook page, he called the crime completely terrible and described Holloway as a freaking savage monster. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable violence. Not only had Lise been murdered, but the killer had taken the additional, calculated step of decapitating her. This wasn't a crime of passion that had gone too far, this was something else entirely. The level of violence suggested either extreme rage or a complete disconnection from normal human emotion. But the horror didn't end there. As investigators processed the scene, they discovered that Lisa's head was missing. The killer had taken it from the apartment, leaving behind a scene that would traumatize the responding officers and haunt the community for years to come. The investigation quickly focused on finding the missing head and identifying the perpetrator. Given the intimate nature of the violence and the fact that there were no signs of forced entry, investigators immediately began looking at people close to Lise. DeAndrea Holloway's name came up quickly in the investigation. As Lisa's on-and-off boyfriend of 2 years, he was an obvious person of interest. When investigators tried to locate him for questioning, they discovered he was missing. This disappearance immediately elevated him from person of interest to prime suspect. In cases like this, when someone close to the victim suddenly becomes unavailable for questioning, it rarely bodes well for their innocence. Law enforcement agencies across the region were alerted to be on the lookout for Holloway. His photograph was circulated, and a manhunt began. In small communities like Alton, word spreads quickly, and soon everyone knew that police were looking for the man suspected of this horrific crime. The search didn't last long. Just days after Lisa's body was discovered, Holloway was found and apprehended by the Gillespie Police Department during what was initially reported as a theft investigation. The details of his arrest suggest that he was engaging in other criminal activities while on the run, possibly trying to gather resources to stay hidden or flee further. While Holloway was in custody, investigators continued working the crime scene and following leads. One of their most pressing concerns was locating Lisa's head, both for the sake of a complete investigation and to provide some measure of closure to her family. The search led them to a dumpster, where they made the grim discovery that completed the horrific puzzle of Lisa's murder. Holloway had disposed of her head like it was trash, showing a level of disrespect for human life that shocked even experienced investigators. This discovery confirmed what investigators already suspected, that this wasn't just a murder, but a calculated act of violence that included the deliberate dismemberment and disposal of the victim's body. The fact that he had taken the time and effort to remove the head from the apartment and dispose of it separately suggested premeditation or at least a concerning level of calculation after the fact. Holloway was formally charged on June 13, 2022, just 4 days after the discovery of Lisa's body. The charges were severe and multiple: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Lise, 1 for her unborn child, 2 counts of intentional homicide of an unborn child, dismembering a human body, and various other related charges. The legal proceedings that followed would span nearly 3 years, creating additional anguish for Lisa's family. Court cases, especially in capital murder situations, can be lengthy processes filled with delays, motions, and procedural requirements that can feel endless to those seeking justice. One significant delay came in 2023 when questions arose about Holloway's fitness to stand trial. In August of that year, he was declared unfit, meaning that mental health professionals had determined he was not competent to understand the proceedings against him or assist in his own defense. This is not an uncommon occurrence in cases involving extreme violence. Sometimes the same mental state that allows someone to commit such acts also renders them incompetent to stand trial. For families of victims, these delays can be excruciating, as they watch the legal process grind slowly forward while their loved one remains in the ground and the perpetrator remains alive. However, by February 2024, Holloway had been restored to fitness and deemed competent to proceed with his trial. The legal machinery began moving forward again, though the path to resolution was still long. The murder of Lise Dodd sent shockwaves through the Alton community that extended far beyond the immediate circle of friends and family. In small towns, violent crime of this magnitude doesn't just affect the direct victims, it changes the entire community's sense of safety and security. Chief Pulido's emotional response in the police department's Facebook video reflected the feelings of many community members. This wasn't just another case to be processed and filed away. This was an attack on one of their own, a young woman who had just moved to their town seeking a new beginning. The pregnancy aspect of the crime made it even more devastating for the community. Lise wasn't just a murder victim, she was an expectant mother, someone who represented hope and the future. Her death meant the loss of 2 lives, the destruction of potential that would never be realized. Neighbors began locking doors that had previously stayed open. Parents held their children a little closer. The comfortable assumption that things like this don't happen here was shattered, replaced by the stark reality that evil can surface anywhere, even in quiet river towns in the Midwest. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is the loss of Lisa's unborn child. At 8 months gestation, the baby was nearly full term, just weeks away from taking its first breath. The child had a name, probably had a nursery prepared, certainly had a mother who loved them before they were even born. In the eyes of the law, this constituted a separate murder, which is why Holloway faced multiple charges of homicide. But beyond the legal implications, this represents the destruction of an entire future that will never unfold. Birthdays that will never be celebrated, first steps that will never be taken, a voice that will never be heard. For Lisa's family, this double loss was particularly cruel. They weren't just mourning the death of a daughter and sister, but also the grandchild, niece, or nephew they would never meet. The baby shower that would never happen, the lullabies that would never be sung. After years of legal proceedings, the case finally reached its conclusion on January 17, 2025. Rather than proceed to trial, Holloway accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, and concealment of a homicidal death. Associate Judge Neil Schroeder presided over the sentencing hearing, where Holloway received a total of 60 years in prison. The sentence was structured as 30 years for the first-degree murder charge, with additional time for the other charges, ensuring that he would serve the maximum possible time under the plea agreement. Madison County State's Attorney Tom Hain expressed satisfaction with the outcome, noting that it was unlikely Holloway would ever see the light of day. At 25 years old at the time of sentencing, Holloway would be in his 80s before becoming eligible for release, assuming he lived that long. For Lisa's family, the sentencing represented a measure of justice, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. The state's attorney acknowledged the continued anguish the family had endured during the lengthy legal proceedings, noting that the case had caused continued angst and uncertainty for Lisa's loved ones. As we try to make sense of this tragedy, we're confronted with questions that may never have satisfactory answers. What drives someone to commit such an act of violence against someone they once claimed to love? How does a relationship that presumably began with affection and hope deteriorate to the point where one person becomes capable of such brutality? The on-again, off-again nature of Lise and Holloway's relationship suggests a pattern of instability that may have escalated over time. Domestic violence experts often note that the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave permanently. Lisa's move to Alton could have been seen by Holloway as such an attempt at permanent separation. The pregnancy adds another complex layer to the dynamic. Whether the child was his or not, Lisa's impending motherhood represented a fundamental change in her life priorities. The focus that once might have been on their troubled relationship was now shifting to preparing for her child. For someone with control issues, this shift could have been intolerable. But even understanding these psychological dynamics doesn't make the act any less horrific or incomprehensible. The level of violence involved, not just the murder, but the decapitation and disposal of the head, suggests something beyond normal human emotion or reasoning. The impact of Lisa's murder extends far beyond the immediate facts of the case. Her mother, who made the horrific discovery, will carry those images for the rest of her life. The responding officers who processed the scene were traumatized by what they witnessed. The community members who knew and loved Lise continue to grapple with the loss of someone who represented hope and new beginnings. There are also the secondary victims, friends who lost a cherished relationship, family members who lost a daughter, sister, or cousin, and community members who lost their sense of safety and security. In cases like this, the circle of those affected spreads outward like ripples on a pond, touching lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Medical professionals who might have helped deliver Lisa's baby instead found themselves dealing with the aftermath of violence. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had to grapple with evidence so disturbing that it challenged their professional objectivity. Even the judge who presided over the case was forced to confront the depths of human cruelty in ways that likely stayed with him long after the gavel fell. While it may seem inappropriate to look for lessons in such a dark story, ignoring the warning signs that cases like this present does a disservice to future potential victims. The pattern of an unstable, on-and-off relationship is one that appears frequently in domestic violence cases that escalate to homicide. The fact that Lise had moved to a new town suggests she may have been trying to establish distance from a troubling relationship. This kind of geographical separation can be an important safety strategy, but as this case tragically demonstrates, it's not always sufficient protection. For those who might find themselves in similar situations, trapped in cyclical, unstable relationships with partners who display controlling or violent tendencies, Lisa's story serves as a stark reminder that leaving can be the most dangerous time. Professional support, safety planning, and sometimes legal intervention may be necessary to break free safely. 60 years in prison, is it enough for taking 2 lives in such a brutal manner? This is a question that family members, community members, and observers of the case will each answer differently. Our justice system attempts to balance punishment, deterrence, and the practical realities of incarceration, but it can never truly restore what was lost. For Lisa's family, no sentence could bring back their daughter or the grandchild they never got to meet. No amount of time behind bars can undo the trauma of discovery or erase the images that will haunt them forever. Justice, in cases like this, is less about equivalency and more about ensuring that the person responsible can never hurt anyone else. The fact that Holloway will likely spend the rest of his natural life in prison does provide a measure of protection for society. At 25, with a 60-year sentence, he will be well into his 80s before becoming eligible for release, assuming he survives that long in the prison system. As we near the end of this story, it's important that we remember this story is not really about DeAndrea Holloway or the evil he committed. It's about Lise Dodd, a 22-year-old woman who deserved to live, to become a mother, to watch her child grow up, to experience all the joys and sorrows that make up a full life. Lise was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future. She was 8 months pregnant, probably picking out baby names, setting up a nursery, imagining what her child would look like and who they might become. She had moved to a new town, perhaps hoping for a fresh start and a peaceful environment in which to raise her baby. Her life had value beyond her relationship with her killer. She had dreams, fears, favorite foods, songs that made her happy, people she loved who loved her back. She was preparing for one of life's most profound transformations, becoming a mother, when her story was cut brutally short. For Lisa's family, January 17, 2025, marked the end of the legal proceedings, but not the end of their grief. Sentencing doesn't bring closure in the way that people often imagine. The pain doesn't suddenly stop because justice has been served. Birthdays still pass without celebration, holidays arrive with an empty chair at the table, and quiet moments are still filled with thoughts of what might have been. Her mother will forever carry the dual burden of grief for her lost daughter and the traumatic memory of that discovery. The image of walking into that apartment, expecting perhaps to find Lise in early labor or dealing with a dead phone battery, only to discover a scene of unimaginable horror, is not something that therapy or time can completely heal. There will be milestones that hurt in unexpected ways: the day Lisa's baby would have been born, the child's first birthday that will never come, school years that will never begin. Each of these represents not just the loss of Lise, but the loss of the future generations that would have followed. In Alton, Lisa's story has become part of the community's collective memory. It's a reminder of the fragility of safety, the importance of supporting neighbors and friends who might be in dangerous relationships, and the reality that evil can surface anywhere. The local police department, led by Chief Pulido, demonstrated remarkable compassion and dedication in their handling of the case. Their emotional response to the crime showed that they saw Lise not just as a case number, but as a person worthy of justice and respect. Community members likely still think of her when they pass the apartment on Bolivar Street, when they hear news of domestic violence cases, or when they encounter young pregnant women starting their families. Her story has become a cautionary tale, but also a call to awareness and action. Lisa's murder, while extreme in its brutality, is part of a larger pattern of violence against women, particularly intimate partner violence that escalates to homicide. According to national statistics, women are more likely to be killed by current or former intimate partners than by strangers or other types of perpetrators. The pregnancy aspect of this case also reflects a disturbing trend. Homicide is one of the leading causes of death for pregnant women in the United States, and domestic violence often escalates during pregnancy. The reasons are complex and varied, but they can include issues of control, jealousy about shifting attention, stress about impending parenthood, or concerns about financial responsibility. Understanding these patterns doesn't make individual cases any less tragic, but it does help us recognize warning signs and develop better prevention strategies. It reminds us that domestic violence is not a private matter, but a public health issue that affects entire communities. As our story comes to a close, we're left with the silence that follows such profound violence. The apartments on Bolivar Street have returned to their quiet routine. The legal system has moved on to other cases. The news cycle has shifted to other stories. But for those who knew and loved Lise Dodd, the silence is filled with memory. It's filled with what-ifs and if-onlys. It's filled with the echo of a voice that will never be heard again and the cry of a baby who will never draw breath. This silence is not empty, though. It's pregnant with meaning, with the weight of a life that mattered, with the importance of remembering those we've lost to senseless violence. It calls us to be better, to watch out for each other, to speak up when we see signs of trouble, and to value the precious nature of human life. Tonight, we've traveled together through one of the darkest chapters in the recent history of Alton, Illinois. We've witnessed the destruction that can result from toxic relationships, the devastation that violence brings to families and communities, and the long journey towards something that resembles justice. We've remembered Lise Dodd not just as a victim, but as a person who deserved to live, to love, and to become the mother she was preparing to be. We've honored her memory by telling her story with respect and care, ensuring that she is remembered as more than just the circumstances of her death. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you'll say a quiet prayer or hold a gentle thought for Lise and her unborn child, for her family who continues to grieve, and for all those who have been touched by this tragedy. And perhaps you'll also hold close the people in your own life, remembering how precious and fragile our time together really is. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to the quiet suburban streets of Bristol Township, Pennsylvania, where in the spring of 1991, a family's ordinary Friday afternoon would become the beginning of a mystery that would span more than 3 decades. This is the story of Joy Hibbs, a devoted mother whose life was cut tragically short, and the long road to justice that her family would travel. The year 1991 feels like a different world now. The Cold War had just ended, the internet was still a concept most people couldn't imagine, and communities like the Croydon section of Bristol Township maintained that small-town feel where neighbors knew each other and children walked home from school without fear. It was in this seemingly safe haven that Joy Ann Hibbs lived with her family, unaware that someone she trusted would soon shatter their peaceful existence forever. Joy Ann Hibbs was 35 years old in the spring of 1991, a woman in the prime of her life with everything to live for. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, caring, and completely devoted to her family. She worked as a medical assistant, a profession that suited her naturally nurturing personality. Joy found satisfaction in helping others, whether it was through her work or simply being there for friends and neighbors in times of need. At home, Joy was the heart of the Hibbs family. She and her husband Charlie had built what seemed like an ideal life together in their modest home at 1200 Spencer Drive in the Croydon section of Bristol Township. The house sat on a quiet residential street lined with similar homes, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and parents felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Their 2 children were Joy's greatest pride. David, her son, was a typical teenager navigating the challenges of high school. Angie, her daughter, was growing into a young woman with her mother's kind spirit. Joy balanced her work responsibilities with being an active, present mother who never missed an opportunity to support her children's interests and activities. Beyond her roles as wife and mother, Joy had a deep appreciation for the outdoors. She loved camping trips where the family could escape the routine of daily life and connect with nature. Fishing was another passion she shared with Charlie and the children, those quiet moments by the water where conversation flowed naturally and the pressures of modern life seemed to melt away. These outdoor adventures weren't just hobbies for Joy, they were opportunities to strengthen family bonds and create the kind of memories that would sustain her loved ones through difficult times. Charlie Hibbs worked construction, a physically demanding job that required him to leave home early and often return late. But the couple had found their rhythm over the years of marriage. Joy managed the household with the same efficiency she brought to her work, ensuring that despite their busy schedules, the family remained close-knit and connected. Neighbors often remarked on how well the Hibbs family got along, how you could hear laughter coming from their backyard during summer barbecues, and how Joy always had a kind word or helping hand for anyone who needed it. The spring of 1991 had been particularly good to the family. Charlie's construction work was steady, providing financial security that allowed Joy to focus on her part-time medical assistant position without the stress of financial pressure. The children were doing well in school, and the family was making plans for summer camping trips. It seemed as though the Hibbs family had found that elusive balance between work and life, between individual pursuits and family time. Joy's friends from work would later say that she had seemed especially happy in the weeks leading up to April 19th. She spoke often about her children's accomplishments, shared photos of recent family outings, and talked excitedly about the camping season ahead. There was no indication that anything was troubling her, no sign that she felt threatened or unsafe in any way. In their neighborhood, the Hibbs family was well regarded. Joy was the type of neighbor who would bring soup to someone who was sick, who would volunteer to help organize community events, and who always remembered birthdays and anniversaries. Her home was often filled with the children's friends, drawn not just by the warm atmosphere but by Joy's genuine interest in their lives and activities. This was the woman whose life would be brutally cut short on a Friday afternoon in April, whose death would leave a family shattered and a community asking how such evil could touch someone so good. But to understand the full tragedy of what happened to Joy Hibbs, we must first understand the ordinary, beautiful life she had built, a life that made her loss all the more devastating for those who loved her. Friday, April 19, 1991, began like any other day in the Hibbs household. The morning routine was familiar and comfortable. Charlie preparing for another day of construction work, the children getting ready for school, and Joy organizing her schedule around her medical assistant duties. There was nothing to suggest that this would be the last normal morning the family would ever experience together. Charlie left for work early, as was his custom in the construction industry. Starting early meant finishing at a reasonable hour, something that both he and Joy appreciated because it allowed for more family time in the evenings. His colleagues would later confirm that he arrived at the job site on schedule and worked a full day, providing him with an ironclad alibi for the events that would unfold. David and Angie followed their usual school day routine, gathering books and backpacks, grabbing quick breakfasts, and heading out to catch their rides to school. It was a typical teenage morning, probably filled with the usual complaints about early hour and upcoming tests or assignments. Joy would have sent them off with her customary reminders to have good days and be careful, the kind of maternal send-offs that children often find embarrassing but later cherish in memory. After her family departed, Joy had the house to herself for a few hours before her work shift. This quiet time was something she valued, an opportunity to handle household tasks without interruption, to perhaps enjoy a cup of coffee in peace, or simply to gather her thoughts before diving into the demands of her job. The house on Spencer Drive was comfortable and welcoming, a reflection of Joy's personality and her attention to creating a warm home environment. What happened next remains partially shrouded in mystery, but investigators would later piece together a horrific sequence of events. Sometime during those morning hours when Joy was alone, someone she knew entered her home. This wasn't a random break-in by a stranger. The evidence would later suggest that Joy knew her attacker, that she had allowed this person into her house willingly, trusting them as she would any neighbor or friend. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Joy fought for her life in what investigators would determine was a vicious struggle. She was beaten, stabbed multiple times, and ultimately strangled. The violence was excessive, suggesting either extreme rage or a desperate attempt to ensure that Joy couldn't identify her attacker. The crime scene would tell a story of terror and resistance, of a woman who refused to go quietly despite being overpowered. But the killer's work was far from over. In what would prove to be a calculated attempt to destroy evidence, the attacker set fire to the Hibbs home. This wasn't a simple matter of lighting a match and leaving. The arson was methodical and deliberate, designed to consume not just Joy's body but any trace evidence that might lead investigators to the perpetrator. The fire was set in multiple locations throughout the house, ensuring maximum destruction. Meanwhile, David Hibbs was going through the motions of a normal school day, unaware that his world was being destroyed. He attended classes, talked with friends, and probably looked forward to the weekend like any teenager would. When the final bell rang that afternoon, he began his routine walk home, expecting to find his mother preparing for her work shift or perhaps starting dinner preparations. But as David approached Spencer Drive that April afternoon, something was clearly wrong. Smoke was visible in the distance, and as he got closer to his own street, the acrid smell of a house fire filled the air. Emergency vehicles were already on the scene, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars with their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in urgent colors. The house David had left that morning as a safe haven was now an inferno. Flames were shooting through the roof, windows were blowing out from the intense heat, and firefighters were working desperately to control the blaze. David would later recall the surreal experience of watching his childhood home being devoured by fire, not yet understanding the full magnitude of the tragedy unfolding. "I opened the back door and I saw flames," David would remember years later, his voice still carrying the weight of that traumatic moment. It was a scene that would be burned into his memory forever, the desperate search for his mother, the growing realization that she was somewhere inside that inferno, and the helpless feeling of being unable to do anything to save her. The firefighters worked with practiced efficiency, but house fires are unpredictable and dangerous adversaries. The deliberate nature of this fire, set in multiple locations, made their job even more challenging. By the time they were able to enter the structure safely, it was clear that anyone trapped inside would not have survived. When the flames were finally extinguished and the smoke cleared enough for a thorough search, firefighters made the discovery that would transform this from a tragic house fire into a murder investigation. In David's bedroom, they found the charred remains of Joy Hibbs. Even in death, the fire had not been kind to her, but trained investigators could see immediately that this had been no accident. The positioning of the body, the evidence of trauma that had occurred before the fire, the deliberate nature of the blaze, all of these factors painted a clear picture for the responding officers. Joy Hibbs had been murdered, and someone had tried very hard to cover up that crime. As word spread through the neighborhood that evening, the tight-knit community of Croydon was shocked. House fires were tragic but not uncommon. Murder, however, was something that happened in other places, to other people. The realization that someone among them was capable of such violence sent ripples of fear and suspicion through streets where neighbors had always trusted each other. For the Hibbs family, April 19, 1991, marked the end of everything they had known and the beginning of a journey through grief, unanswered questions, and a quest for justice that would consume more than 3 decades of their lives. The transformation of the Spencer Drive house fire from a tragic accident to a murder scene happened swiftly once investigators arrived and began their preliminary examination. What the firefighters had initially approached as a standard house fire response became something far more complex when the evidence began telling a different story entirely. The first responders, firefighters, paramedics, and patrol officers, were experienced professionals who had seen their share of house fires. But there were immediate red flags that suggested this was not a typical accidental blaze. The fire pattern, the multiple points of origin, and the apparent use of accelerants all indicated arson. When Joy's body was discovered in David's bedroom, positioned in a way that suggested she had not simply been overcome by smoke, the investigation took on an entirely different character. The Bucks County authorities who took over the scene understood they were dealing with a homicide that someone had gone to great lengths to disguise. The deliberate nature of the arson was clear. This wasn't a panicked attempt to destroy evidence but a calculated effort to eliminate any traces that might lead investigators to the killer. Multiple fire origin points throughout the house indicated someone who had taken time to ensure maximum destruction. The coroner's examination of Joy's remains would later confirm what investigators suspected from the crime scene. Despite the extensive fire damage, the autopsy revealed that Joy had died before the flames consumed her. She had been beaten severely, stabbed multiple times, and ultimately strangled. The violence was extensive and personal, suggesting either someone who knew her well or someone who had been in an extreme emotional state during the attack. Within days of the murder, investigators had identified their primary suspect, Robert Atkins, a neighbor who lived in the same Croydon area. Atkins was well known to local police, but not necessarily in the way one might expect. Rather than being known as a dangerous criminal, Atkins had a more complex relationship with law enforcement. He worked as a confidential informant, providing information about drug activities in the area. This relationship between Atkins and the police would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. When investigators began looking into Atkins as a suspect, they were reportedly told to stay away from him because of his role as an informant. His handler, a narcotics detective, apparently wanted to protect his source, even in the face of a murder investigation. This interference would have far-reaching consequences that wouldn't become fully apparent for decades. The evidence pointing to Atkins was compelling from the very beginning. Neighbors reported seeing him in the area on the day of the murder. There were indications that he had been inside the Hibbs home recently. Some witness statements suggested unusual behavior from Atkins in the days following Joy's death. But despite these indicators, the investigation seemed to stall almost as quickly as it had begun. Police did conduct one interview with Atkins at his Falls Township home, 5 days after the murder. This interview was conducted at his residence rather than at the police station, a somewhat unusual procedure for a primary suspect in a murder case. The details of this interview would remain largely private for years, but it apparently did not produce enough evidence to file charges immediately. What happened next would baffle and frustrate the Hibbs family for decades to come. Despite having a clear suspect, despite evidence that seemed to point in Atkins' direction, despite the brutal nature of the crime that demanded justice, the investigation simply seemed to lose momentum. Files were put away, active investigation ceased, and the case became what law enforcement calls cold. The family was told that investigators were still working on the case, that new leads were being followed, that justice would eventually come. But months turned into years, and years turned into decades, with no arrests, no new developments, and precious few answers for a family desperate to understand why their wife and mother had been taken from them in such a violent way. During those early years, Charlie Hibbs would often visit the police station, asking for updates, hoping for new information, pressing for continued investigation. David and Angie, trying to process their grief while growing up without their mother, would ask their father regularly if there was any news about who had killed her. The answer was always the same: the case remained under investigation, but there were no new developments to report. The impact of this investigative limbo on the family cannot be overstated. Grief is difficult enough to process under normal circumstances, but when it's complicated by unanswered questions, by the knowledge that someone got away with murder, by the suspicion that not everything possible was being done to find justice, that grief becomes a more complex and enduring burden. Community members who had known and loved Joy also struggled with the lack of resolution. In a small neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, the idea that a killer was walking among them, unpunished and unidentified, created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would persist for years. Who could be trusted? Who might be capable of such violence? These questions haunted the Croydon community long after the physical evidence of the fire had been cleared away and the Spencer Drive house rebuilt. The Hibbs case became a cautionary tale about how investigations can be derailed by competing priorities, about how institutional inertia can overcome the demands of justice, and about how families of victims can become secondary considerations in complex law enforcement operations. It would take a new generation of investigators, with fresh eyes and different priorities, to finally restart the quest for justice that had been abandoned so many years earlier. The aftermath of Joy Hibbs' murder created a void that extended far beyond the immediate family, rippling through their extended network of friends, colleagues, and neighbors in ways that would persist for decades. As 1991 became 1992, then 1995, then 2000, the lack of progress in the investigation became a source of mounting frustration and bewilderment for everyone who had known and cared about Joy. For Charlie Hibbs, the years following his wife's death were marked by a peculiar form of torture, the constant hope that today might be the day someone would call with news of an arrest, coupled with the growing realization that such a call might never come. He continued working construction, maintaining the home he and Joy had shared, and trying to provide stability for David and Angie as they navigated their teenage years without their mother's guidance. Charlie's visits to the police station became a regular ritual, though one that grew increasingly hollow with each passing year. He would arrive with questions: had there been any new leads? Were investigators still actively working the case? Was there anything the family could do to help? The answers were always polite but ultimately unsatisfying: yes, the case remained open; no, there were no new developments; and no, there wasn't really anything the family could do except wait. These conversations took a psychological toll on Charlie that was visible to those who knew him well. Friends and relatives watched as a man who had always been optimistic and forward-looking became more guarded, more suspicious of others, more prone to the kind of dark thoughts that accompany unresolved trauma. The construction sites where he worked became refuges where physical labor could temporarily distract from the mental anguish of not knowing who had killed his wife or why they remained free. For David and Angie Hibbs, growing up in the shadow of their mother's unsolved murder presented unique challenges that most teenagers never have to face. The normal process of adolescent development, learning to trust others, forming relationships, developing independence from parents, was complicated by the knowledge that someone they had probably known and trusted had committed an unthinkably violent act against the most important person in their lives. David, who had discovered the house fire that day, carried additional trauma from having been the first family member on the scene. The image of his home in flames, the desperate search for his mother, the growing realization of what had happened, these memories became intrusive thoughts that could surface at any time, triggered by something as simple as the smell of smoke or the sound of sirens. His teenage years were marked not just by typical adolescent concerns but by a hypervigilance about safety, a difficulty trusting others, and a persistent anger about the injustice of his mother's death going unpunished. Angie faced similar challenges but experienced them differently. As Joy's daughter, she had lost not just a mother but the woman who should have been there to guide her through the complexities of becoming a young woman. The absence was felt most acutely during milestone moments, graduations, first relationships, career decisions, when Joy's advice and support would have been invaluable. The fact that her mother's killer remained unknown and unpunished added an extra layer of pain to these already difficult moments. Both children struggled with a fundamental question that children of murder victims often face: if someone could kill their mother and get away with it, what did that say about the world they were growing up in? How could they feel safe anywhere if the most basic assumption of civilized society, that murderers will be caught and punished, had been violated so fundamentally in their own lives? The extended family and friends of the Hibbs family were also affected by the lack of resolution. Joy had been a central figure in many people's lives, the kind of person others turned to in times of trouble, the organizer of family gatherings, the friend who remembered everyone's birthdays. Her death left a void in multiple social networks, but the fact that her killer remained free made it impossible for these relationships to heal normally. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where Joy's absence was felt acutely, but where bringing up the investigation often led to uncomfortable silence or frustrated outbursts about the lack of progress. Friends struggled with how to maintain relationships with Charlie and the children without constantly reminding everyone of the unresolved tragedy that had torn their family apart. The neighborhood where the Hibbs family lived was also changed by the unsolved murder. The Croydon section of Bristol Township had been the kind of place where neighbors trusted each other implicitly, where children played outside without fear, where doors were left unlocked and strangers were welcomed. Joy's murder introduced an element of suspicion and fear that fundamentally altered the community's character. Neighbors found themselves looking at each other differently, wondering who might be capable of violence, who might be hiding dark secrets. The fact that investigators had identified a suspect but had never made an arrest meant that everyone knew someone in their community was likely a killer, but no one knew who. This uncertainty poisoned relationships and changed the way people interacted with each other in subtle but significant ways. Property values in the immediate area around Spencer Drive declined, not just because of the negative association with violent crime but because potential buyers were reluctant to move into a neighborhood where a murderer might still be living. The house where Joy had died was eventually rebuilt, but it remained a physical reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Local media would occasionally revisit the case, especially around the anniversary of Joy's death, but these stories became increasingly brief and routine as the years passed without new developments. The lack of progress meant there was little new to report, and public attention gradually shifted to more recent crimes and tragedies. For law enforcement agencies involved in the case, the unsolved murder of Joy Hibbs became an embarrassment that was easier to ignore than to address. The case file gathered dust, and newer investigators who might have brought fresh perspectives to the evidence were often assigned to more recent cases that seemed more likely to produce results. This institutional neglect was perhaps the most maddening aspect of the situation for the Hibbs family. They understood that police departments had limited resources and that newer cases might take priority, but they couldn't understand why a case with a known suspect and apparent evidence couldn't be pursued more aggressively. The family's repeated requests for information were met with increasingly perfunctory responses that offered no real hope for progress. As the years stretched into decades, the Hibbs family was forced to confront the possibility that Joy's murder might never be solved, that her killer might die of old age or natural causes before ever being held accountable. This realization brought a different kind of grief, not just for the loss of Joy, but for the loss of faith in justice itself. The case became a stark reminder of how the criminal justice system can fail victims and their families, not through malice or incompetence, but through institutional inertia, competing priorities, and the simple passage of time. For more than 30 years, the Hibbs family lived with the knowledge that someone had gotten away with murder, and that the system they had trusted to deliver justice had failed them in the most fundamental way possible. The resurrection of Joy Hibbs' murder case began not with a dramatic breakthrough or new evidence, but with something far more mundane yet ultimately more powerful, a change in institutional priorities and personnel within the Bucks County District Attorney's Office. Sometimes justice arrives not because of new technology or witness revelations, but because someone in a position of authority decides that old cases deserve fresh attention. By the late 2010s, advances in forensic science had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated and could extract meaningful information from smaller and more degraded samples. Digital databases allowed investigators to cross-reference evidence in ways that weren't possible in 1991. Perhaps most importantly, a new generation of investigators had taken over cold case units, bringing fresh perspectives unburdened by the institutional knowledge and potential conflicts of interest that had stalled the original investigation. The decision to revisit the Hibbs case was part of a broader initiative to review unsolved murders that had occurred decades earlier. These reviews weren't random, they focused on cases where there had been identified suspects but no arrests, where evidence existed but had never been properly pursued, and where families had never received the closure they deserved. When investigators opened Joy Hibbs' case file after years of inactivity, they found a treasure trove of evidence that had been collected but never fully exploited. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, forensic evidence, and interview transcripts had been preserved, waiting for someone with the time, resources, and determination to piece them together into a prosecutable case. The new investigators approached the case with several advantages their predecessors had lacked. First, they were removed from any personal or professional relationships that might have complicated the original investigation. Second, they had access to modern forensic techniques that could extract more information from the physical evidence. Third, they were working in an era where law enforcement agencies were more willing to challenge the decisions and priorities of previous investigations. Most importantly, the new investigators weren't bound by the informal arrangements and considerations that had apparently protected Robert Atkins in the early 1990s. His role as a confidential informant, which had seemingly made him untouchable during the original investigation, no longer carried the same weight. The detective who had handled him as an informant had long since retired, and the drug cases he had provided information about were ancient history. As the new investigators reviewed the case file, a clearer picture began to emerge of what had happened on April 19, 1991, and why the original investigation had stalled. The evidence pointing to Atkins was substantial and had been from the very beginning. Witness statements placed him in the area at the time of the murder. Physical evidence suggested he had been inside the Hibbs home. His behavior after the murder had raised suspicions among neighbors and acquaintances. But the new team also discovered something that explained the decades of inaction, documentation suggesting that Atkins' handler had actively interfered with the murder investigation. Notes in the file indicated that detectives had been told to avoid pursuing Atkins as a suspect because it might compromise ongoing narcotics investigations. This revelation was both enlightening and infuriating. It suggested that the Hibbs family's 30-year quest for justice had been derailed not by lack of evidence or investigative dead ends, but by institutional priorities that valued drug cases over murder cases. The investigators also benefited from changes in Atkins' circumstances over the intervening years. By the time the case was reopened, he was no longer a useful informant. His knowledge of 1990s drug operations was obsolete, and his own criminal activities had made him more of a liability than an asset to law enforcement. There were no longer competing interests to protect him from scrutiny. The new investigation team began systematically re-examining every piece of evidence, re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive and willing to talk, and applying modern forensic techniques to physical evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. This methodical approach revealed connections and patterns that had been overlooked or ignored during the original investigation. Witness testimony that had seemed inconsistent in 1991 began to make more sense when viewed through the lens of modern understanding about witness reliability and trauma responses. Physical evidence that had been inconclusive with 1990s technology yielded more definitive results when subjected to contemporary analysis techniques. The investigators also had the advantage of perspective that comes with time. Behavioral patterns that might not have seemed significant in 1991 took on new meaning when viewed as part of a three-decade pattern of criminal activity. Associates and family members of Atkins who had been reluctant to speak to police in the immediate aftermath of the murder were more willing to cooperate years later, especially as they realized the full scope of his criminal behavior. Perhaps most importantly, the new investigators approached the case with a determination to pursue justice regardless of institutional obstacles or political considerations. They understood that the Hibbs family had been failed by the system once, and they were committed to ensuring it didn't happen again. The renewed investigation wasn't just about applying modern techniques to old evidence, it was about fundamentally changing the priorities and approach that had allowed a murder case to remain unsolved for 3 decades. It represented a recognition that victims' families deserved better from their criminal justice system, and that cold cases weren't just unsolved puzzles but ongoing injustices that demanded attention. This shift in approach and priority would ultimately lead to developments that the Hibbs family had waited more than 30 years to see. But the path from a reopened investigation to actual justice would require navigating legal, procedural, and evidentiary challenges that reflected how much the criminal justice system had changed since 1991. The breakthrough in Joy Hibbs' case came not as a sudden revelation but as the culmination of months of painstaking investigative work that gradually built an overwhelming case against Robert Atkins. By early 2022, investigators had assembled a body of evidence that they believed was sufficient to finally seek justice for a crime that had gone unpunished for over 3 decades. The decision to present the case to a grand jury represented a significant milestone in the long journey toward accountability. Grand jury proceedings are conducted in secret, allowing investigators to present their evidence without the public scrutiny that might compromise ongoing investigative efforts. For the Hibbs family, the mere fact that the case was being presented to a grand jury represented more progress than they had seen in the previous 30 years combined. The grand jury process began in January 2022, with prosecutors presenting a comprehensive case that included physical evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence that collectively painted a compelling picture of Atkins' guilt. The prosecutors had to overcome the challenges of presenting a decades-old case where some witnesses had died, memories had faded, and physical evidence had deteriorated, but they had also benefited from the preservation of crucial evidence and the application of modern forensic techniques. The evidence presented to the grand jury revealed the careful planning and deliberate nature of Joy's murder and the subsequent arson. Investigators had determined that Atkins had entered the Hibbs home willingly invited by Joy, who had no reason to fear her neighbor. The attack had been swift and brutal, suggesting either premeditation or an explosive rage that had quickly escalated to lethal violence. The arson had been methodically planned and executed, with multiple ignition points throughout the house designed to ensure maximum destruction of evidence. This wasn't a panicked attempt to cover up a crime of passion but a calculated effort to eliminate any traces that might lead investigators back to the perpetrator. The thoroughness of the arson attempt suggested that Atkins understood the importance of destroying physical evidence and had taken considerable time and care to ensure the fire would consume everything. Witness testimony presented to the grand jury included neighbors who had seen Atkins in the area on the day of the murder, individuals who had observed his suspicious behavior in the days following Joy's death, and people who had heard him make statements that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt or knowledge of details that only the killer would know. The grand jury also heard evidence about Atkins' criminal history and pattern of behavior that supported the theory that he was capable of the violence inflicted on Joy Hibbs. This evidence painted a picture of a man with a history of aggressive behavior, substance abuse problems, and a willingness to use violence to solve problems or cover up other crimes. Perhaps most damaging to Atkins were the forensic evidence and physical connections that linked him directly to the crime scene. Despite the extensive fire damage, investigators had preserved evidence that modern forensic techniques could analyze more thoroughly than had been possible in 1991. This evidence provided scientific support for the witness testimony and circumstantial evidence that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. On May 25, 2022, more than 31 years after Joy Hibbs had been murdered, the grand jury returned an indictment against Robert Atkins. The charges were comprehensive and reflected the full scope of his criminal activity that day: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, robbery, burglary, and multiple counts of arson. Each charge carried significant penalties, and taken together, they ensured that if convicted, Atkins would spend the rest of his life in prison. The arrest of Robert Atkins was a moment of profound emotional complexity for the Hibbs family. After more than 3 decades of waiting, wondering, and hoping, they finally had the news they had dreamed of hearing: someone was being held accountable for Joy's death. But the arrest also brought with it a flood of emotions that had been suppressed or managed over the years: anger at how long it had taken, grief that Joy hadn't lived to see justice served, and anxiety about whether the prosecution would be successful. For David Hibbs, who had discovered the burning house as a teenager and lived with that traumatic memory for over 30 years, the arrest represented validation that his family hadn't been forgotten by the system. But it also meant reliving the worst day of his life in a very public forum as the case proceeded through the courts. Angie Hibbs faced similar emotional challenges as the case moved forward. The arrest meant that her mother's death would once again become the subject of intense scrutiny, that family members would have to testify about their loss, and that the privacy they had built around their grief would be invaded by the necessary publicity of a criminal trial. Charlie Hibbs, now in his 70s, had lived most of his adult life under the shadow of his wife's unsolved murder. The arrest brought relief but also highlighted just how much of his life had been spent waiting for this moment. The years of uncertainty, of wondering if justice would ever come, of watching his children grow up without their mother while her killer remained free, all of these experiences couldn't be undone by an arrest, no matter how satisfying it might be. The community response to Atkins' arrest was equally complex. For neighbors who had lived for decades with the knowledge that a killer walked among them, the arrest brought relief and validation of their suspicions. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many people had suspected Atkins over the years and why it had taken so long for law enforcement to act on that evidence. Local media coverage of the arrest was extensive, not just because of the heinous nature of the crime but because of the extraordinary length of time that had passed between the murder and the charges. The case became a symbol of how cold case investigations could eventually succeed, but also of how institutional failures could delay justice for decades. For law enforcement agencies involved in the case, the arrest represented both a triumph and an acknowledgement of past failures. While current investigators deserved credit for finally building a prosecutable case, the arrest also highlighted the systemic problems that had allowed Atkins to remain free for over 3 decades despite substantial evidence of his guilt. The arrest was just the beginning of what would be a complex legal process. Atkins would have the right to a vigorous defense, and prosecutors would have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt using evidence that was more than 30 years old. But for the first time since April 19, 1991, the Hibbs family had reason to hope that Joy's death might finally be answered with justice. The trial of Robert Atkins began on January 29, 2024, in a Bucks County courtroom where 3 decades of waiting would finally culminate in justice. Judge Wallace Bateman Jr. presided over the bench trial, with prosecutor Jennifer Shorn presenting evidence that included witness testimony, forensic analysis, and circumstantial evidence linking Atkins to the brutal murder and arson. The prosecution's case methodically established that Atkins had been in the area on the day of the murder, had access to the Hibbs home, and possessed both the means and opportunity to commit the crime. Witnesses testified about seeing Atkins near the Spencer Drive house on April 19, 1991, and about his suspicious behavior in the days following Joy's death. The evidence showed that Joy had been beaten, stabbed multiple times, and strangled before the house was deliberately set on fire in multiple locations to destroy evidence. The methodical nature of the arson demonstrated premeditation and a calculated attempt to cover up the murder. Defense attorney Robert Goldman argued that the passage of time had compromised the evidence and that the prosecution couldn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt after so many years. However, the preserved physical evidence and consistent witness testimony painted a compelling picture of Atkins' guilt. On February 23, 2024, after reviewing all the evidence, Judge Bateman found Robert Atkins guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, robbery, burglary, and arson. At age 75, Atkins was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Hibbs family, the conviction represented the end of a journey that had consumed more than half their lives. David Hibbs, now in his 50s, had waited 33 years to see his mother's killer held accountable. The teenager who had discovered his burning home in 1991 was now a middle-aged man who could finally find some measure of peace. The sentencing brought a bittersweet closure. While justice had finally been served, it couldn't restore the years of uncertainty, the family gatherings without Joy's presence, or the children who had grown up without their mother's guidance. Charlie Hibbs, now in his 80s, had lived most of his adult life under the shadow of his wife's unsolved murder. The case highlighted both the persistence required for cold case investigations and the institutional failures that can delay justice for decades. The original investigation had been compromised by Atkins' role as a police informant, with investigators reportedly told to stay away from him despite compelling evidence of his guilt. Joy Hibbs was remembered by those who knew her as a devoted mother, caring medical assistant, and loving wife who found joy in simple pleasures like family camping trips and quiet moments with her children. Her life was cut short at 35, but her memory sustained her family through more than 3 decades of seeking justice. The case serves as a reminder that some crimes echo across generations, that families never stop seeking answers, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can eventually prevail. Robert Atkins will spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime committed in 1991, proof that accountability, though long overdue, can still be achieved. For the community of Bristol Township, the conviction brought closure to a case that had haunted their neighborhood for decades. The knowledge that Joy's killer had finally been identified and punished allowed old wounds to begin healing and restored faith in the possibility of justice, even when it arrives later than anyone hoped. Tonight, as we remember Joy Hibbs and her family's long journey toward justice, we're reminded that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered, whose loss created ripples of grief that lasted for decades, and whose memory deserved the justice that finally came in 2024, 33 years after her death. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we travel to Portland, Oregon, where the aroma of fresh bread and simmering sauces filled the halls of the Oregon Culinary Institute. It's a story that reads like fiction, involving a romance novelist, a beloved chef, and a crime that shocked the culinary community. This is the story of Daniel Brophy, whose life was cut short in the very kitchen where he nurtured dreams and taught students the art of cooking. Daniel Craig Brophy was born on June 27, 1954, into a world that would eventually revolve around flavors, textures, and the joy of feeding others. At 63 years old, Dan had found his calling as both a chef and instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland. Those who knew him described him as more than just a teacher. He was a mentor, a passionate craftsman who believed that cooking was an act of love. The Oregon Culinary Institute wasn't just any cooking school. It served dual purposes as both an educational facility and a working restaurant, where students could practice their skills while serving real customers. Dan had been part of this community for years, arriving early most mornings to prepare for classes, his dedication evident in every lesson he taught. He was the kind of instructor who remembered every student's name, who stayed late to help someone perfect their knife skills, and who genuinely cared about nurturing the next generation of chefs. His colleagues would later testify that Dan was an incredible instructor, someone whose passion for cooking was infectious. But Dan's life wasn't just about the professional kitchen. At home, he was married to Nancy Crampton Brophy, a woman who shared his love for creativity, though hers manifested through the written word rather than culinary arts. Nancy Crampton Brophy was 68 years old in 2018, a self-published romance novelist who had been writing for years. She crafted stories of passion, betrayal, and sometimes, darker themes. Her novels typically featured strong female protagonists navigating complex relationships, often with titles that promised steamy romance and dramatic plot twists. But Nancy's writing extended beyond romance novels. In 2011, she had published a blog post that would later take on sinister significance. The post was titled, "How to Murder Your Husband, and Other Handy Household Tips." At the time, it seemed like a tongue-in-cheek piece about the frustrations of marriage, the kind of dark humor that many couples might relate to. In the essay, Nancy had written about various methods one might theoretically use to eliminate a troublesome spouse, discussing everything from poison to accidents. She concluded the piece by noting that the hardest part wouldn't be the act itself, but getting away with it. It was meant to be satirical, a writer's exploration of a dark theme. But words, once written, have a way of echoing through time. Nancy and Dan's marriage had its complexities. On the surface, they appeared to be a creative couple, he expressing himself through food, she through fiction. But beneath the surface, financial pressures were mounting. Nancy's writing career, while fulfilling, wasn't particularly lucrative. Dan's teaching salary, while steady, wasn't making them wealthy. The couple owned a home valued at around $300,000, but they carried significant debt. Nancy had taken out life insurance policies on Dan totaling approximately $1.5 million, a detail that would later become crucial to understanding the events that followed. Saturday, June 2, 2018, began like many others at the Oregon Culinary Institute. It was a test day for students, which meant Dan would be overseeing practical examinations, watching as his pupils demonstrated the skills they'd been learning. These were important days in the academic calendar, where students' futures in the culinary world would be partially determined by their performance. Dan left his home that morning, as he had countless times before, heading to the institute located at 1701 Southwest Jefferson Street, just outside downtown Portland. The building was quiet in the early morning hours, as it typically was on weekends before students arrived. At exactly 7:21 a.m., Dan used his key to enter the building and disarmed the security system. The surveillance cameras captured this routine action, a man beginning what he expected to be just another day of teaching, of sharing his passion for cooking with eager students. Dan was alone in the building at this point, preparing for the day ahead. He likely went through his usual routine, checking the kitchens, ensuring everything was ready for the students who would arrive later. The Oregon Culinary Institute was his domain, a place where he felt comfortable and purposeful. But Dan wasn't entirely alone that morning. Unknown to him, someone else was in the vicinity. When students began arriving for their examinations later that morning, they expected to find Chef Brophy ready to guide them through their tests. Instead, they made a discovery that would forever change the Oregon Culinary Institute and shatter the Portland culinary community. Dan's body was found in Kitchen 1, the main instructional kitchen where he had taught countless students over the years. He had been shot twice with a 9mm weapon. The bullets had struck him in the back and chest, killing him almost instantly. 2 shell casings were found at the scene, cold metal remnants of a violent act that seemed completely at odds with the nurturing environment Dan had worked so hard to create. The kitchen, usually filled with the sounds of chopping, sizzling, and friendly instruction, was now a crime scene. Police cordoned off the area where Dan had fallen, where his life had ended among the stainless steel counters and professional-grade equipment he had used to teach others. The Portland Police Bureau immediately launched a homicide investigation. The circumstances were puzzling. Who would want to harm a beloved cooking instructor? Dan had no known enemies, no apparent conflicts that would lead to such violence. The building's security system showed that only Dan had entered that morning, which meant the killer had either followed him inside or had their own way of accessing the building. Investigators began the methodical process of examining the crime scene, collecting evidence, and trying to piece together what had happened in those crucial morning hours. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery. Dan's wallet was untouched, and nothing appeared to have been stolen from the institute. This wasn't a random crime or a burglary gone wrong. This was targeted, deliberate, and deeply personal. As news of Dan's murder spread through Portland's tight-knit culinary community, shock and grief rippled through the ranks of chefs, restaurateurs, and former students. Dan was universally beloved, making his death even more incomprehensible to those who knew him. Detectives began the difficult process of investigating the personal life of the victim, looking for any clues that might explain why someone would want Dan dead. They interviewed his colleagues at the institute, his friends, and his family. What they found was consistent testimony about a man who was kind, dedicated, and seemingly without enemies. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to focus on the person closest to Dan, his wife, Nancy. Nancy's initial reaction to learning about her husband's death seemed appropriate for a grieving widow. She appeared shocked and devastated by the news. But investigators are trained to look beyond surface emotions, to examine facts and evidence rather than rely solely on emotional displays. Several factors began to draw police attention to Nancy. First, there was the matter of the life insurance policies. Dan carried substantial coverage, with Nancy as the primary beneficiary. While life insurance alone isn't evidence of murder, the large payout, approximately $1.5 million, provided a potential motive. Then there was Nancy's whereabouts on the morning of the murder. Initially, she told investigators she had been at home, but surveillance footage would later reveal a different story. Cameras captured Nancy's van driving past the Oregon Culinary Institute on the morning Dan was killed, contradicting her initial statement about where she had been. But perhaps most intriguingly, there was Nancy's 2011 blog post about murdering one's husband. While it had been written as a humorous essay 7 years earlier, in the context of Dan's actual murder, it took on a much darker significance. Modern criminal investigations often rely heavily on digital evidence, and the Brophy case was no exception. Investigators obtained warrants to examine Nancy's computer and internet search history, looking for any evidence that might connect her to the crime. What they found was troubling. In the months leading up to Dan's murder, Nancy had been researching firearms, specifically Glock pistols, the same type of weapon used to kill her husband. Her search history revealed queries about gun parts, ammunition, and how firearms work. Even more damning was evidence that Nancy had been researching untraceable firearms, often called ghost guns. These are weapons that can be assembled from parts purchased separately, making them difficult to trace back to the buyer. Investigators found evidence that Nancy had purchased components that could be used to build such a weapon. The internet searches painted a picture of someone methodically researching how to commit murder while avoiding detection. It wasn't the casual research of a novelist seeking inspiration for her fiction, it was focused, practical, and deeply concerning. Police also discovered that Nancy had been experiencing financial difficulties. Her romance novels weren't selling well, and the couple had been struggling with debt. The life insurance money would solve many of their financial problems, but only if Dan was dead. While the digital evidence was compelling, investigators knew they needed physical proof to build a solid case against Nancy. The murder weapon had never been found, which presented a significant challenge. Without the gun that killed Dan, prosecutors would have to rely on other forms of evidence. During a search of Nancy's home, police discovered a Glock 17 pistol. However, ballistics testing revealed that this particular weapon had not been used in the murder. The bullets that killed Dan had been fired from a different gun, one that remained missing. But investigators also found something else during their search of Nancy's property, components for building what's known as a ghost gun. These included a gun kit and various parts that could be assembled into a functioning firearm. Nancy later claimed these items were research materials for her writing, but the specific nature of the components suggested a more practical purpose. Perhaps most significantly, investigators found evidence that Nancy had purchased a replacement barrel for a Glock pistol. This was crucial because when a gun is fired, the barrel leaves unique markings on the bullet, a ballistic fingerprint that can connect a specific weapon to a specific crime. By swapping out the barrel, someone could potentially use a gun to commit murder and then replace the incriminating part, making it impossible to connect the weapon to the crime. Prosecutors would later allege that Nancy had done exactly this, used her Glock to kill Dan, then replaced the barrel and disposed of the original one. It was a sophisticated plan that demonstrated knowledge of forensics and criminal investigation techniques. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Nancy came from surveillance cameras in the area around the Oregon Culinary Institute. Traffic cameras and business security systems had captured her van driving past the institute on the morning of the murder, directly contradicting her claim that she had been at home. The timeline was particularly telling. The surveillance footage showed Nancy's vehicle in the vicinity of the culinary school at approximately 7:20 a.m., just minutes before Dan disarmed the building's security system. This suggested that Nancy had followed her husband to work that morning, lying in wait for the right moment to act. When confronted with this evidence, Nancy couldn't provide an explanation for why she had been in the area or why she had initially lied about her whereabouts. This contradiction between her statements and the physical evidence further strengthened the case against her. The surveillance evidence painted a picture of premeditation. Nancy hadn't acted impulsively or in the heat of passion. She had deliberately followed Dan to his workplace, waited for him to enter the building alone, and then carried out her plan. On September 5, 2018, nearly 3 months after Dan's murder, Portland police arrested Nancy Crampton Brophy at her home. The investigation had been thorough and methodical, with detectives carefully building their case before making an arrest. When police arrived at her door, Nancy's first words were reportedly, "You must think I murdered my husband." It was an unusual response. Most innocent people, when confronted by police, would ask what was wrong or express confusion. Nancy's immediate assumption about why police were there would later be cited as evidence of her guilty knowledge. Nancy was charged with second-degree murder in the death of her husband. The charge reflected the prosecution's belief that while the murder was intentional, it hadn't been premeditated for an extended period, though the evidence would suggest otherwise. The arrest sent shockwaves through both the Portland culinary community and the romance writing world. Here was a woman who had written about murder as fiction, now accused of committing murder in reality. The irony wasn't lost on observers, and the case quickly attracted national attention. Nancy's case moved through the legal system slowly, as complex murder cases often do. She was held without bail, deemed a flight risk given the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence against her. Her defense team faced a significant challenge. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming: the life insurance motive, the internet searches for firearms, the surveillance footage placing her at the scene, and her initial false statements to police. While there was no smoking gun, the accumulation of evidence painted a compelling picture of guilt. The defense strategy focused on challenging the circumstantial nature of the evidence and suggesting that someone else could have committed the murder. They argued that Nancy's internet searches were legitimate research for her writing, and that the gun parts found at her home were simply props for authenticity in her novels. But the prosecution had built a methodical case that addressed each of these potential explanations. The specificity of Nancy's internet searches, the timing of her presence near the crime scene, and the financial motive all combined to create a narrative that was difficult to refute. Nancy Crampton Brophy's trial began in April 2022, nearly 4 years after Dan's murder. The delay had been caused by various factors, including the complexity of the case and the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on court proceedings. The prosecution, led by the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, methodically presented their case. They called witnesses from the Oregon Culinary Institute who testified about Dan's character and the events of June 2, 2018. Colleagues described him as beloved by students and staff alike, a man who had no enemies and lived for teaching. Digital forensics experts testified about Nancy's internet search history, walking the jury through her queries about firearms, ammunition, and untraceable weapons. The searches showed a progression of learning, from basic questions about how guns work to specific information about ghost guns and replacement parts. Surveillance experts presented the video evidence showing Nancy's van near the Culinary Institute on the morning of the murder. The timestamps were precise, placing her in the area at the exact time Dan would have been alone in the building. Financial experts testified about the couple's debts and Nancy's potential gain from Dan's death. The life insurance policies totaled approximately $1.5 million, enough to solve their financial problems and provide Nancy with a comfortable independent life. The defense presented their case by trying to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative. They called character witnesses for Nancy, people who testified that she was a loving wife who seemed devoted to Dan. They argued that her internet searches were legitimate research and that her presence near the Culinary Institute could have been coincidental. But the defense faced an uphill battle. The combination of motive, means, and opportunity was difficult to explain away. Most damaging was Nancy's inability to provide an innocent explanation for being near the crime scene or for initially lying to police about her whereabouts. Throughout the trial, Nancy's 2011 blog post about murdering one's husband cast a long shadow over the proceedings. While written years before Dan's actual death, the essay demonstrated that Nancy had thought about the concept of spousal murder in detail. In the post, she had written about various methods of killing a spouse, ultimately concluding that the challenge wouldn't be the act itself but avoiding detection afterward. She had specifically mentioned the importance of not being caught, suggesting an understanding of criminal investigation techniques. The prosecution argued that this essay provided insight into Nancy's mindset and planning. While she claimed it was satirical writing, they suggested it was actually a blueprint that she eventually decided to execute. The defense tried to downplay the essay's significance, arguing that many writers explore dark themes in their work without any intention of acting on them. Crime writers, they pointed out, regularly research murder methods for their fiction without becoming killers themselves. But in the context of all the other evidence, the essay took on a sinister quality. It suggested that Nancy had been thinking about murdering Dan for years, not just in the months immediately before his death. After more than 7 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury in May 2022. The jury had to weigh the circumstantial evidence and decide whether it proved Nancy's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On May 25, 2022, after deliberating for several days, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Nancy showed little emotion as the verdict was read, but the weight of the decision was enormous. She was now a convicted murderer, found responsible for ending the life of the man she had been married to for years. The verdict brought some measure of justice for Dan's family and friends, who had waited nearly 4 years to see his killer held accountable. For the Portland culinary community, it provided closure to a tragedy that had shaken their tight-knit world. But questions remained. The murder weapon was never found, and Nancy maintained her innocence even after the verdict. The exact details of how the crime was committed remained somewhat mysterious, known only to Nancy herself. On June 13, 2022, Nancy Crampton Brophy returned to court for sentencing. Second-degree murder in Oregon carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At 71 years old, Nancy faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The judge, in imposing the sentence, noted the calculated nature of the crime and the impact on Dan's family and the broader community. Dan's colleagues from the Oregon Culinary Institute were present at the sentencing, having supported each other through the long legal process. They spoke about the loss of a beloved teacher and mentor, a man whose passion for cooking had inspired countless students. Nancy's own family was torn apart by the case. Some continued to maintain her innocence, unable to reconcile the woman they knew with the calculated killer described by prosecutors. Others accepted the verdict and tried to find ways to move forward. Nancy was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Given her age, it was effectively a life sentence. She would be 96 years old before becoming eligible for parole. Nancy is currently serving her sentence at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, Oregon. The women's prison is about 20 miles south of Portland, a world away from the life she once knew as a romance novelist and chef's wife. The Oregon Culinary Institute, where Dan taught for years, has since closed. The building on Southwest Jefferson Street, once filled with the sounds of learning and cooking, stands empty. The closure wasn't directly related to Dan's murder, but the tragedy marked the end of an era for the Portland culinary community. Dan's former students and colleagues remember him fondly, sharing stories of his patience, expertise, and genuine care for their development as chefs. Some have gone on to successful culinary careers, carrying forward the lessons he taught them not just about cooking, but about professionalism and passion. The case has been featured in numerous true crime programs and documentaries, including episodes of Dateline NBC and other major shows. In 2023, Lifetime produced a television movie about the case titled, How to Murder Your Husband, The Nancy Brophy Story, starring Sybil Shepherd as Nancy and Steve Guttenberg as Dan. The murder of Daniel Brophy represents a particularly tragic form of domestic violence, the calculated killing of a spouse for financial gain. Unlike crimes of passion, where emotions run high and decisions are made in moments of intense feeling, this was a methodical execution of a plan that had been developing for months or possibly years. The case highlights the dark side of financial desperation and the lengths some people will go to solve their problems. Nancy and Dan's financial difficulties weren't insurmountable. They could have downsized their home, sought financial counseling, or found other legitimate solutions. Instead, Nancy chose murder as her path to financial freedom. It also demonstrates the danger of online research in criminal planning. Nancy's internet searches provided a roadmap of her intentions, creating a digital trail that ultimately helped convict her. In the modern age, very little remains truly private, and criminal investigators have become increasingly sophisticated in using digital evidence. The role of surveillance technology was also crucial to solving the case. Without the cameras that captured Nancy's van near the crime scene, prosecutors would have had a much more difficult time placing her there at the time of the murder. Modern cities are blanketed with surveillance systems that can track movements and provide crucial evidence in criminal cases. Perhaps most chilling is the way Nancy's fiction seemed to predict her reality. Her essay about murdering a husband, written years before Dan's death, demonstrated a mind that was capable of thinking through the logistics of spousal murder. While many writers explore dark themes, few actually act on them. Nancy crossed that line from imagination to action, from fiction to horrific reality. The murder of Daniel Brophy represents a particularly tragic form of domestic violence, the calculated killing of a spouse for financial gain. Unlike crimes of passion, where emotions run high and decisions are made in moments of intense feeling, this was a methodical execution of a plan that had been developing for months or possibly years. The case highlights the dark side of financial desperation and the lengths some people will go to solve their problems. Nancy and Dan's financial difficulties weren't insurmountable. They could have downsized their home, sought financial counseling, or found other legitimate solutions. Instead, Nancy chose murder as her path to financial freedom. It also demonstrates the danger of online research in criminal planning. Nancy's internet searches provided a roadmap of her intentions, creating a digital trail that ultimately helped convict her. In the modern age, very little remains truly private, and criminal investigators have become increasingly sophisticated in using digital evidence. The role of surveillance technology was also crucial to solving the case. Without the cameras that captured Nancy's van near the crime scene, prosecutors would have had a much more difficult time placing her there at the time of the murder. Modern cities are blanketed with surveillance systems that can track movements and provide crucial evidence in criminal cases. Perhaps most chilling is the way Nancy's fiction seemed to predict her reality. Her essay about murdering a husband, written years before Dan's death, demonstrated a mind that was capable of thinking through the logistics of spousal murder. While many writers explore dark themes, few actually act on them. Nancy crossed that line from imagination to action, from fiction to horrific reality. Beyond the legal proceedings and media coverage, this case represents the destruction of human lives and relationships. Dan Brophy was a man who had found his calling in teaching others, sharing his passion for cooking with students who looked up to him as a mentor and guide. His death cut short not just his own life, but the positive impact he continued to have on others. For Dan's family and friends, the trial provided some measure of justice but couldn't restore what was lost. The Oregon Culinary Institute community lost not just a teacher, but a cornerstone of their educational mission. Students who had learned from Dan carried his lessons forward, but they also carried the trauma of losing their instructor to such senseless violence. Nancy's own family was torn apart by her actions and the subsequent investigation and trial. Her children had to grapple with the reality that their mother was capable of murder, that the woman who had raised them had calculated the death of their stepfather. Some relationships within the family have never recovered. The case also had broader impacts on the romance writing community, raising uncomfortable questions about the relationship between violent fiction and real-world actions. While most writers who explore dark themes do so purely as creative expression, Nancy's case became a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of dwelling too deeply on violent fantasies. The Daniel Brophy murder case offers several important lessons about domestic violence, financial desperation, and criminal planning. It shows how domestic violence can take many forms, not just physical abuse during an argument, but calculated murder executed over months of planning. The case also highlights the importance of taking threats seriously, even when they appear to be jokes or fiction. Nancy's essay about murdering her husband seemed like dark humor at the time, but it may have been an early indication of her actual intentions. In relationships where financial stress is mounting, such statements should be viewed with concern rather than dismissed as harmless venting. From a law enforcement perspective, the case demonstrates the power of combining different types of evidence, digital, surveillance, financial, and physical, to build a comprehensive case. No single piece of evidence was enough to convict Nancy, but together they painted a compelling picture of guilt. The case also shows the evolution of criminal investigation in the digital age. Nancy's internet searches provided a window into her planning process, allowing investigators to understand her mindset and preparation. Modern criminals leave digital footprints that can be just as incriminating as physical evidence. As Nancy Crampton Brophy serves her life sentence in Oregon's Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, the story of Daniel Brophy's murder serves as a stark reminder of how greed and desperation can lead to unthinkable acts. A romance novelist who wrote about love and passion ultimately chose hate and violence, ending the life of the man who shared her home and her dreams. Dan's legacy lives on in the students he taught, the colleagues he worked alongside, and the Portland culinary community that still remembers his contributions. His passion for cooking and teaching continues to inspire others, even though his voice was silenced by the very person who should have supported and protected him. The Oregon Culinary Institute may be closed, and Kitchen 1 may no longer echo with the sounds of learning, but the lessons Dan taught about professionalism, creativity, and following one's passion continue to resonate. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting memorial to a man whose life was cut short but whose impact on others endures. Nancy's story serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of financial desperation and the terrible consequences of choosing violence as a solution to life's problems. Her romance novels, once filled with stories of love conquering all, now seem hollow in light of her ultimate choice to destroy rather than cherish the love in her own life. The murder of Daniel Brophy stands as a reminder that the most dangerous enemies sometimes sleep in the same bed, and that the line between fiction and reality can sometimes disappear with devastating consequences. In a case where a romance novelist wrote about murder and then committed it, the boundary between imagination and action proved all too fragile. Tonight, as Portland's culinary community continues without one of its beloved teachers, and as Nancy spends another night behind bars, the story of Daniel Brophy's murder serves as both a tragedy and a warning about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Rest in peace, Daniel Brophy, teacher, chef, and victim of a crime that should never have moved from fiction to reality. And that concludes tonight's story of the murder of Daniel Brophy. Thank you for listening to this true crime case. Sleep well, and remember that even in the darkest stories, justice can prevail, and the memories of good people like Dan continue to inspire others long after they're gone. Good night.